Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I worked as a receptionist at a small IT company in Atlanta this summer before my junior year of high school. It was a tiny operation, just 6 employees, including the owner, who did most of the client negotiations. The company's bread and butter was handling IT support for small and mid-sized businesses. But every once in a while, they took on odd jobs that required traveling outside the city. One of the guys who handled these travel jobs was M, a middle-aged black man who had been working there for a few years. M was one of those people who made you feel at ease the moment you met him. He was funny, easygoing, and always had a story to tell. He was also one of the most reliable employees at the company, which was why the boss often sent him on these out-of-town jobs. That summer, M was assigned to deliver and install a set of new servers for a company in North Georgia. This was before GPS systems were standard in every car, and while MapQuest existed, it wasn't always accurate for rural areas. So M, being old school, relied on a paper map and handwritten directions to get him where he needed to go. He had done these types of trips before without issue, so he wasn't too worried. He set out early in the morning, making good time on the highways, but as he got deeper into the mountains, the roads became more confusing. The farther he drove, the more the trees thickened, the houses became more sparse, and the roads turned into winding 2-lane stretches of cracked asphalt. Eventually, he realized he had missed a turn. Stopping at a small gas station, M stepped out to ask for directions. The place was old, the kind of gas station that looked more like a wooden shack than a business, with an ancient-looking soda machine out front and a single gas pump that still had a manual dial. There was no one else in the lot except for an elderly woman and a younger woman, probably in her 40s, standing near the entrance. They were chatting as they sipped from styrofoam cups. M approached them politely and asked for directions. The older woman seemed delighted to help. She spoke in that warm, slow drawl common in the deep south, smiling as she carefully wrote out each step of the route. The younger woman nodded along, adding a detail here and there. When they handed him the paper, he thanked them and walked back to his car, feeling relieved. Following the directions, he drove deeper into the mountains. The pavement turned into gravel, then eventually into a dirt road. The trees closed in around him, dense and untouched. It felt isolated, too isolated. At first, he ignored the bad feeling creeping in. He had driven through rural areas before. This wasn't that unusual. But as the minutes passed and he saw no signs of houses, businesses, or anything other than forest, his unease grew. He glanced at the directions again. They seemed correct, but something felt off. He kept driving. Then ahead of him, the road narrowed. It looked like it hadn't been driven on in years. Grass was growing through the tire tracks, and the trees were starting to overtake the path. No way this was the right way to a business. Something wasn't right. M pulled over, shutting off the engine. He grabbed his map from the passenger seat and unfolded it, trying to find where he had gone wrong. As he did, he reached toward the glove compartment and unlatched it. Inside was his handgun. It was legal, licensed, and he never planned to use it unless absolutely necessary. But his gut told him to be prepared. Then he heard something, distant at first, a faint rustling, then a few more sounds, voices. It was coming from behind him. M turned and looked in his rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. They were blocking the road, at least 50 of them, dressed in white robes and hoods, standing shoulder to shoulder. Some held wooden bats, others carried torches, and all of them were staring straight at him. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It didn't seem real. It felt like something out of a history book, something long gone. But there they were, right in front of him, in the middle of nowhere. And he was alone. His breathing was steady, but his heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He didn't panic. He had been in the military. He had learned to assess situations quickly and react accordingly. He kept his hands steady as he reached for his gun. The men outside started moving toward his car. The first hit came from the side. Someone slammed their hands against his passenger window. Then another. They were surrounding him, pressing against the car, rocking it back and forth. He could hear them shouting. The words were ugly, full of hate. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and sweat. M kept his face blank, his hands calm, and lifted the gun. He didn't point it immediately. He just tapped the window with it. The sound cut through the noise. A few of them paused. Others still rocked the car. Then he turned and locked eyes with the closest man. A large one, standing just a foot away, his hood slightly pulled back to reveal his face. M raised the gun and pointed it directly at him. The effect was immediate. The man's face twitched. His whole body stiffened. He stepped back, just a little, and the others noticed. Then M shifted slightly, making it clear he wasn't afraid to use it. The crowd hesitated. Then, like dominoes, they started stepping back. M knew what was happening. They had assumed he was helpless. But a man with a gun, trained to use it, was not an easy target. And none of them seemed eager to test whether he would pull the trigger. The path was still blocked, but M wasn't going to wait around. With one swift motion, he put the car into reverse, slammed his foot on the gas, and peeled backward down the dirt road. Gravel flew up behind him, dust clouding the air. The men scattered, some falling over each other to get out of the way. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He kept driving in reverse until he hit a wider spot in the road, then spun the car around in a tight, controlled turn and gunned it back the way he came. His pulse stayed steady, but the back of his neck burned with the feeling of being watched. The gas station, the old woman, the daughter, they had sent him there on purpose. He drove until he hit a main road, not stopping until he saw a real gas station, one with people, traffic, and lights. He parked, locked the doors, and just sat there. For a long time, he didn't move. The reality of what had almost happened settled in his chest like a weight. He checked his phone. No signal. He wasn't surprised. Finally, after making sure he hadn't been followed, he started the car again. This time, he pulled out his own map, found the right way to his destination, and drove there without stopping. By the time he arrived, it was hours later than planned. But he didn't explain. He just did his job, finished the install, and left. When he got back to Atlanta, he told the story once. Just once. To the boss. Nobody else. And then he never spoke about it again. Because some stories don't need retelling. Some memories are too dangerous to dwell on. And some places, no matter how small or forgotten, are still the wrong place to be lost. I had been on the job for just under 2 years when we got the call. It was mid-afternoon, middle of summer, and the sun was beating down on the station parking lot as I wiped sweat from my forehead. We had just finished a drill, running hose lines in full gear, and most of us were standing around catching our breath when the tones dropped. The dispatcher's voice came over the speaker, sharp and clear. Engine 3, Squad 2, respond to a construction site, worker trapped under heavy machinery. Unknown injuries. 1432 East Harding. The address meant nothing to me at first, but as we hustled toward the truck, someone muttered, "That's the new commercial site, big lot, lots of equipment." We climbed into the rig, the diesel engine roaring to life as our driver pulled us out of the bay. The air inside the cab was thick with the usual mixture of adrenaline and quiet tension. No one spoke much. We all knew that when someone was trapped under something heavy, it was never good. I sat in the back, running through possibilities in my head. Maybe it was a trench collapse. Maybe a piece of equipment tipped over. Maybe they were pinned but stable, just waiting for us to free them. I had no idea what we were about to roll up on. The siren wailed above us as we cut through traffic. I stared out the window, watching buildings blur past, before glancing down at my gloves, flexing my fingers inside them. By the time we got close, we could already see the cranes and scaffolding in the distance, the skeleton of a new building stretching toward the sky. The whole site was surrounded by chain-link fencing, and as we pulled in, a group of construction workers stood near the entrance, waving us down. Their faces told me everything. Eyes wide, faces pale. A few of them had their hands over their mouths, looking away. Others looked like they wanted to run, to put distance between themselves and whatever had just happened. Our driver braked hard, and we piled out fast. One of the workers jogged up to us, his hard hat slightly crooked, sweat dripping down his face. "He's over there," he said, voice shaky as he pointed toward a flat, open section of dirt where a steamroller sat motionless. It backed over him. "He's still awake. Still awake." That sent a jolt through me. We moved fast, stepping over thick power cables and scattered tools as we made our way toward the machine. More workers stood at a distance, silent, eyes locked on the ground. No one dared get closer. And then I saw him. At first, it didn't make sense. His upper body looked fine. His safety vest, his work shirt, his arms, they were all there untouched. But from the waist down, it was... My brain struggled to process it. The steamroller's back drum sat directly on his midsection. His legs were almost flattened, spread slightly apart in the dirt. The ground around him was dark, wet. His boots were still on. His thighs were barely more than fabric and crushed bone, his pelvis wedged beneath thousands of pounds of steel. But his face was what got me. He was awake. His head was tilted forward slightly, looking down at his own ruined body. His breathing was fast but steady, his hands resting on the ground at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. I could hear him muttering something under his breath. I took a step closer and realized he was talking to himself, repeating the same few phrases. So stupid, why did I do that? His voice was eerily calm, like he was lecturing himself about a minor mistake. My captain crouched beside him, speaking in a low voice, but I already knew the truth. We all did. The moment we moved that steamroller, the pressure that was keeping him alive was going to be gone. We had seen it before. Crush syndrome. The weight of the machine had clamped down on his lower body, cutting off blood flow. His spinal cord had likely been severed, which was why he wasn't feeling anything. Right now, his body was in a state of shock, his mind tricked into thinking he wasn't dying. But the moment we moved it, everything would change. His blood, trapped for too long, would rush back into his system, carrying with it the toxins from his crushed tissue. His organs, already deprived of proper circulation, would fail within minutes. There was no coming back from this. A medic knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his wrist, but it was just a formality. The guy was as stable as he was going to be, for now. I swallowed hard, looking away for a moment, trying to push down the sick feeling building in my stomach. The other firefighters stood in a loose circle, their faces unreadable, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't a rescue. This was waiting. The guy's phone was in his hand. His fingers clutched it loosely, and I could see the screen still glowing. He must have called someone. One of the paramedics murmured something to the captain, who gave a slow nod before walking a few steps away, hand on his radio. The guy coughed, just once, then licked his lips and looked up at us. His face was pale, his pupils slightly dilated. I knew the moment he understood. His breathing changed. His fingers tightened around his phone. His eyes, already glassy, started to shift, scanning our faces one by one. He was looking for something. Hope, maybe. None of US could give it to him. The extraction team arrived a few minutes later. We set up equipment, placed IVs, did everything we could to give him the best chance, even if deep down, we knew it was pointless. When the call was made to lift the steamroller, we all took our positions, hands firm, movements controlled. No hesitation. I kept my eyes on his face as we raised it, watched as his body suddenly sagged, his chest rising fast, too fast, his mouth opening slightly like he wanted to say something. Shock hit him instantly. His breathing turned erratic. His arms, the only part of him still functional, trembled. The color drained from his face, so fast it didn't seem real. The medic was already pushing meds, but we knew it wasn't enough. A minute passed, then another. His body shuddered once, then went still. One of the medics pressed fingers to his neck, waiting, listening. Then he shook his head. The construction workers had moved farther back, some with their backs turned. Others stood frozen, staring at the scene, at us, at the body in the dirt. No one spoke. We packed up our gear in silence, coiling hoses, stowing bags. There were no jokes, no comments, none of the usual dark humor we sometimes used to push through rough calls. This one was different. When we finally climbed back into the engine, I stared at my gloves, the same ones I'd flexed my fingers in earlier, now streaked with dirt, grease, and something darker. The ride back was quiet. Even now, after all these years, I don't think any of us ever really talked about that call again. The sky was clear that day. I remember that much. The kind of blue that stretches out endlessly, crisp and perfect, like nothing bad could ever happen under it. I hadn't even been paying attention to the road at first. My father was driving, my older brother was in the passenger seat, and I was in the back. It was just another afternoon, just another drive, until suddenly it wasn't. I remember the way my dad slammed the brakes, the seatbelt yanking me forward. The sudden jolt knocked the breath out of me for a second, and before I could even ask what was happening, I saw it. The truck was on its side, lying across the road like a fallen giant. A gas tanker. Its massive metal body looked unnatural like that, like it didn't belong in that position. It had crashed hard, too fast around a corner, and now it was a wreck. But what froze me, what made my stomach turn and my hands shake, was the cab. The windshield was shattered. The front end crumpled in on itself, trapping the driver inside like a coffin of twisted metal. And he was still alive. Before I even understood what was happening, my dad and brother were out of the car. I scrambled after them, my legs unsteady, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. The air smelled like hot metal, like gasoline, thick and pungent. The truck groaned as it settled, metal creaking under its own weight. And then I heard him, the driver. He was screaming, not just yelling, not just calling for help. Screaming. It was the kind of sound that scraped against your bones, that lodged itself inside your skull and never let go. Pure terror, pure agony. He was trapped. His arms were pinned, his legs twisted beneath the dashboard. Blood streaked his face. One of his eyes was swollen shut, but he was looking at us, pleading, his mouth moving so fast I couldn't even process the words at first. "We have to get him out," my dad said. My brother was already trying, pulling at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The driver thrashed, gasping, trying to push himself free, but he couldn't move. His breath hitched. "Please, please, it's leaking." That's when I saw it. The puddle spreading beneath the wreckage, dark and thick, glistening under the sun. The smell of gas was so strong I could taste it, burning in my nose, sticking to the back of my throat. My dad and brother looked at each other, and then they were running. I didn't understand at first. 1 second they were right there, and the next they were sprinting down the road, back toward the car. My dad shouted something, but the words were lost in the panic, lost in the sound of the driver screaming, lost in the deafening pound of my heartbeat in my ears. I was alone. I didn't even realize it at first. I was still staring at the man, at the blood on his face, the fear in his one good eye. And then I saw the flicker of orange in the puddle of gasoline. The first lick of fire. It was small. So small. Just a tiny flame, barely the size of my palm. But I knew. I knew what was about to happen. The driver knew too. His entire body jerked, his face twisting in horror. "Help me." My body locked up. Every part of me screamed to move, but I couldn't. My feet felt nailed to the ground. The fire spread. The puddle ignited in an instant, flames racing along the fuel like veins filling with blood. The man screamed again. I stepped forward. I don't even remember making the decision. I just moved. "Please," he begged. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely think. I reached for the door, pulled, yanked, slammed my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't open. The heat was rising. The flames crept closer, twisting up the metal, licking at the cab, creeping toward the shattered window. "Get my phone," the man choked out. "Please, please, my wife, my kids." His voice cracked. His body thrashed, trying to reach something near the dashboard, but he couldn't move. I saw it. The phone, lying on the passenger seat, just out of reach. I hesitated. For a second, just a second, I thought about reaching in, grabbing it, handing it to him. The flames touched the door. The heat blasted against my face, burning my skin, my eyes. I stepped back. The man's screams turned desperate, broken. "Please, God, please." The fire climbed higher. His voice turned raw. "Tell them I love them," he sobbed. "Please, tell them." I turned away. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But my body moved on its own, and before I even understood what was happening, I was backing away, then running, stumbling over my own feet, tripping, falling, scrambling back up. The explosion came behind me, a blast of heat and light, so loud it swallowed everything else. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the pavement, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unclench my fists. My ears rang, drowning out everything else. I don't know how long I lay there. At some point, I realized I wasn't alone. A woman was there, standing near me, staring at the burning wreckage. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her hands pressed over her mouth. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say. The flames roared, the smoke rising high into that perfect blue sky. I couldn't move. I couldn't cry. I just sat there watching. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The nightmares started that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way his face twisted in pain, the The way his one good eye locked onto mine. The way his mouth moved, begging, pleading. The way I had turned away. Therapy didn't help. People kept telling me it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have done anything, that I would have died too if I had tried. But I knew the truth. I had a choice, and I ran. The weight of it settled in my chest, heavy and immovable, suffocating. At school, people treated me differently. Some whispered behind my back. Others tried to talk to me like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I wasn't the same person anymore. I stopped talking, stopped caring, stopped sleeping. Because every time I closed my eyes, I was there again, standing in front of the wreckage, listening to him scream, and knowing I had left him there to die. I didn't know her well. She was just someone I recognized from high school. One of those faces you'd pass in the hallway, someone you'd see in group photos but never really talk to. I remember she was pretty, not in a flashy way, but the kind of girl who didn't need to try. Dark hair, bright eyes, the kind of smile that made people like her. I don't think we ever had a full conversation, just a passing familiarity. I probably wouldn't have thought about her again if it weren't for what happened. It started as a story I heard secondhand. A friend of mine mentioned her name casually one day, and I asked, "Oh yeah, what's she up to?" Not because I really cared, but because it was one of those social reflexes. You hear a name, you ask about it. I expected something normal. Maybe she was married now, had a kid, moved out of state. That's usually how these things go. Instead, my friend got quiet. "You don't know?" they asked. And that was when I heard the kind of story that sticks with you forever. She had moved to New York a year or two after high school, looking for something new. I guess she wanted excitement, or maybe she just got tired of small-town life. Either way, she ended up in the city, and at some point, she met a guy. He was charming, good-looking, one of those people who know exactly what to say to make you trust them. It didn't take long before she fell into something with him. Maybe not a full-on relationship, but close enough. She spent a few nights with him. They made out, got close. And after a few days, she left, like people do when things are casual. That was supposed to be the end of it. But then the rash started. At first, it was small. Just some irritation around her lips, like an allergic reaction. She ignored it, thinking it was nothing. Maybe some bad lip balm or dry skin. But then it got worse. The redness spread, and the skin became raw, irritated in a way that wasn't normal. She tried creams, over-the-counter medicine, but nothing worked. If anything, it got worse. When she finally saw a dermatologist, the doctor seemed unsure. He ran some tests, told her they'd call when they had results. She didn't think much of it. But then the call came. The doctor didn't explain anything over the phone, just told her she needed to come in right away. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. She went, probably thinking it was something serious, but still manageable. Maybe an infection, maybe something weird but treatable. That's what people assume, because the alternative is too awful to consider. But when she sat down in that office, the doctor looked at her, and she knew something was wrong. I imagine that moment often. The cold sterility of the room. The way the doctor's face must have looked, concerned, hesitant, like they were about to say something that no one should ever have to hear. The doctor told her the results were unusual. Very unusual. The condition she had wasn't normal. In fact, it wasn't something you could just catch from food, animals, or everyday life. The bacteria they found, this specific infection, was only ever documented in one kind of case. People who ate human flesh. That was it. That was the moment the story turned from strange to horrific. She didn't understand. How could she? The doctor, uncomfortable but direct, said something like, "I'd call the police. I don't know how long she sat there before she moved. I don't know how it must have felt to have reality shift like that beneath her feet. To realize something had happened to her that was so far beyond what most people could comprehend. At some point, she called the police. They took her seriously. They traced the guy's address. And when they raided his place, they found things that no one should ever have to see. A freezer full of human heads. Human meat in his fridge. He had been eating people. And she had kissed him. The realization must have hit her in pieces, spreading like slow poison. She had been that close to him, to his mouth, to his hands. She had trusted him, even if only briefly. And she had gotten something from him. Some infection, some bacteria that only lived in rotting human flesh. I don't know what happened to her after that. I don't know if she ever really recovered, if she ever went back to normal. What do you do after something like that? How do you move on? I imagine she tried. She probably told herself it was over, that she was safe now. But I wonder if she ever truly felt safe again. If she ever kissed another person without thinking about him, without remembering the smell of his apartment, without remembering what was inside his freezer. And I wonder, when she looked in the mirror after that, if she ever saw herself the same way again. Because I wouldn't. I don't. I don't talk to strangers anymore. Not in a real way. People say you can't live like that, but they don't understand. They don't understand that people like him exist. That they look like everyone else. That you can shake hands with them, kiss them, wake up next to them, and never know what's inside their fridge. I don't go outside much anymore. I don't meet new people. And if I do, I don't trust them. I see someone smiling at me, and I don't wonder if they're nice. I wonder what they eat. I wonder what's rotting in their kitchen. And I wonder if I made one mistake, one bad decision, if I'd be the next one in their freezer. I was a kid when it happened, maybe 7 or 8 years old. My parents both worked long hours, and when they couldn't be home to watch me, they'd drop me off at my grandparents' house. It wasn't unusual for me to spend the night there. I never really knew how long my parents worked, only that sometimes they'd come pick me up in the evening, and other times I'd wake up the next morning still at my grandparents' house, eating breakfast with them before my parents arrived. I didn't mind staying over. My grandparents lived on a huge piece of land, 63 acres, mostly open fields with a big hill leading up to their house. Past the fields, there was a thick tree line that stretched out into the woods. It wasn't a deep forest, but it was big enough to feel like one when you were a kid. The house sat at the top of the hill, looking down over everything like a watchful eye. During the day, it was peaceful, and at night, it was just dark. I was a bold, restless kid, too adventurous for my own good. I loved running around outside, especially in the evenings when the fireflies started coming out. I used to chase them for hours, catching them in a glass jar and watching them flicker like tiny stars in my hands. It made me feel like I was in my own little world. That night, it was the same. It was around 8 p.m., not quite pitch black yet, but dark enough that the sky had settled into a deep blue. The last streaks of sunlight were barely clinging to the horizon, and the air had cooled down. It was the perfect time to run outside and chase lightning bugs. I grabbed my jar and took off across the field, running down the hill and toward the open land. The fireflies danced in the air, flickering in and out of sight like little ghosts. I ran after them, laughing to myself, stomping through the tall grass without a care in the world. I must have spent a good 15 minutes just running in circles, catching a few in my jar, watching them glow, and then letting them go again. At some point, I wandered closer to the tree line. Just past the clearing, there was a small open space tucked into the woods. It was like a little pocket in the forest, surrounded by trees, but open in the middle. I had been there before during the day, and I knew that's where the fireflies were the thickest. Without thinking, I pushed into the trees, stepping through the underbrush and into the clearing. It was quiet, too quiet. The air felt still, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The fireflies flickered all around me, but now something about the place felt off. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that it was no different than it had been during the day. So I kept chasing the fireflies, holding my jar out, running in little circles to scoop them up. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. It came from my left, deeper in the forest. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it may as well have been a gunshot. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just a squirrel or a raccoon moving through the trees. I had seen plenty of animals on my grandparents' land before. It wasn't unusual. But then I heard something else. A deep, low grumble. It wasn't loud, but it had weight to it, like it carried through the air in a way that I felt more than I heard. It wasn't a growl, not exactly, but something close. Something deep and unnatural. I turned my head toward the sound slowly, every muscle in my body tensed. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dark, a pair of yellowish eyes stared back at me. They weren't bright, but they had this dull, eerie glow, like embers still smoldering in a fire. My breath caught in my throat. The thing was big. Not huge, but big, bigger than me at the time. I was around 4 feet tall, maybe a little more, and this thing had to be at least a foot taller. Its body was bulky, thick with muscle like a bear, but the shape was wrong. Its head sat lower on its shoulders, its stance hunched, like it was ready to move. I couldn't see it clearly, just the vague outline of its body against the darkness, but it was enough. It took a step forward. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just reacted before my mind could catch up. I spun on my heel and bolted. The second I moved, the thing let out another sound, a deeper, heavier grunt, like a warning. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as my legs would carry me, tearing through the clearing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear it moving behind me. It wasn't running, not yet, but it was following, pushing through the grass, its heavy footsteps crunching against the earth. The sound was enough to push me into pure, blind terror. I hit the edge of the field and felt something snag against my legs. A pine sapling. Somehow, my foot caught it just right, and I went down hard, tumbling into the dirt. My jar flew out of my hands, smashing against the ground, fireflies scattering into the night. For half a second, I was dazed, my brain struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Then I heard it, closer now, just behind me. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sting of scrapes on my hands and knees, and took off again. The hill was just ahead. I could see the house at the top, porch lights glowing like a beacon in the dark. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. I could still hear it behind me, that heavy, steady movement, never running but never stopping either. I reached the base of the hill and started climbing. My legs felt like lead, my whole body screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I wasn't even thinking anymore, just moving. By the time I reached the top, I was screaming. I don't even remember what I said, just that I was yelling for my grandparents, my voice raw with panic. My legs finally gave out, and I stumbled onto the porch, tears streaming down my face. My grandma found me first, panicked, asking what happened. My grandpa came next, and when I told them, breathless, shaking, barely able to get the words out, his face went pale. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to explain it away. He just told me, in a voice I'll never forget, to never go into the woods again. That night, they locked every door, shut every blind, and didn't open a single window. I never went back into those woods. And to this day, I still don't like the outdoors. I never thought my first claim as an insurance adjuster would be something I'd remember for the rest of my life. When I got the assignment, it was just another case file on my desk, a total loss due to a house fire, personal property claim, standard procedure. But nothing about this case would be standard. I arrived at the site early in the morning. The fire had gutted the house, leaving behind the usual aftermath: blackened wood, broken windows, ash settled like dirty snow across the remains. The air still smelled of burnt plastic and scorched wood, a smell that sticks to your clothes and doesn't wash out easily. The place wasn't in a bad neighborhood. It was just an average house on an average street, the kind of place where neighbors actually knew each other, where kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalk. That somehow made it worse. Bad things are supposed to happen in bad places. Not here. I met the insured in the driveway. His name was Michael. Big guy, broad shoulders, thick beard. The kind of guy you'd expect to see moving furniture or fixing a car, not standing there, hollow-eyed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his face lined with exhaustion. When I introduced myself, he just nodded. No small talk, no wasted words. It was hard to look him in the eye. Most people who've lost their homes to fire are in shock, but this was something else. His hands were shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something too heavy to bear. I had to do my job, so I started the process. Walked the property, took photos, checked the foundation, made notes. The fire department had already cleared the scene. No structural integrity left, total loss, just as the report had said. Then I started cataloging the lost belongings. And that's when it hit me. Inside that burned-out home, under the charred beams and melted appliances, were wedding gifts. Boxes of them. Some still recognizable, blenders, dish sets, the metal frame of what had probably been a stand mixer. Others just piles of ash, wrapping paper fused into the remains. Michael was supposed to be married in a few weeks. I kept my head down, writing, checking serial numbers, doing what I had to do. The job had to be done, and I was the one who had to do it. Neighbors and family hovered nearby, whispering. I caught pieces of conversation. Someone asked if he was a suspect. Another person said the police had cleared him. People were watching him, wondering. I knew the answer. I knew before I even read the report. This wasn't a domestic situation. This wasn't arson for insurance money or a lover's quarrel gone bad. This was something worse. Michael's fiancée had been murdered, and then the house had been set on fire. I don't know why that detail was worse than the fire itself, but it was. Maybe because fires have a kind of finality to them. A fire is something that happens, and then it's over. But a murder, especially a murder like this, leaves a wound that never really closes. The man who did it was a drifter. No connection to them. No motive. No reason. Just one of those awful, meaningless things that happen in the world. Random. That was the part one couldn't get over. Michael didn't say much as I worked. He helped when I asked, pointing out where things had been, giving me details when I needed them, but otherwise he just stood there, staring at the wreckage of his life. At one point, I said something. I don't even remember what. Some offhand comment about the paperwork, or maybe something stupid about how things could be replaced. And for just a second, he laughed. It wasn't much, just a breath of a laugh. But it was there. And then it was gone, and his shoulders shook, and suddenly he was holding on to me, this big, strong man breaking apart in my arms. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, letting him cry. We stood there for a long time. Eventually, I had to finish the job. I had to complete the paperwork, file the claim, make sure he got his settlement. But none of it felt like enough. A few months later, they caught the guy who did it. Just like that. A random arrest, a match on fingerprints, a confession. The kind of thing that happens in the background, like a puzzle solving itself after the damage is already done. I heard about it, but I didn't feel any relief. There was no justice that could fix what had been taken from him. The claim got approved. The money went through. The case was closed. But I still think about that day. I still remember the smell of smoke in the air, the weight of that hug, the sound of a man breaking apart. And I still can't talk about it without crying. It was a night that could have easily ended in death. The kind of night where the darkness felt heavier, where the world outside the car windows barely existed beyond the reach of the headlights. I was too young to understand the full weight of it when my grandmother first told me, but I could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the way her voice took on that distant, haunted quality that only comes from memories that have been buried deep for too long. She had never told anyone before. Not my mother, not my uncles or aunts, not even my grandfather. She kept it to herself for decades, locked away like something sacred, or maybe something she didn't want to examine too closely. It wasn't until the end, when the weight of everything she had lived through seemed to press down on her, that she finally let it out. It happened in the 1960s, when my Uncle Ted was still a child. He had been born with spina bifida, a condition that left his spine exposed at birth, requiring immediate surgery and lifelong medical care. In those days, specialized treatment wasn't as accessible as it is now, especially in rural Wisconsin. The closest place he could get the help he needed was in Madison, a 2-hour drive from the small farming community where my grandparents lived. Grandma took him every time. No complaints, no hesitation. She had 5 other kids at home, a household to run, a husband working long hours to provide for them, but Ted needed her. And that was all there was to it. That day had been long. The hospital visits were always exhausting, not just for Ted, who had to endure the poking, prodding, and medical procedures, but for Grandma, who carried the silent burden of knowing that no matter how much care he got, no matter how much love she gave, he would always need more help than she could provide. She never let him see that, though. She never let any of them see the weight she carried. By the time they were on their way home, the sun had already set, and a thick fog had begun rolling in over the hills. The road between Madison and their home was a lonely stretch of highway, 2 lanes cutting through fields and small patches of dense woods, with nothing but scattered farmhouses in the distance. No streetlights, no gas stations, no real landmarks, just occasional side roads leading off into the dark, disappearing into the fog. Grandma hated driving in fog. It swallowed up the road ahead, made the world feel smaller, like anything could be waiting just beyond the headlights. She had to lean forward over the wheel, gripping it tight, squinting into the murky grayness, trying to make out the lines on the pavement. The silence in the car stretched. Ted was tired, staring out the window. He never complained. not even on the longest drives. The hum of the tires on the road, the faint rattle of something loose in the dashboard, the occasional flash of another car's headlights somewhere in the distance. These were the only sounds in the world. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. "Stop!" Grandma's foot slammed the brake before she even had time to think. The tires screeched, the whole car jerked forward, and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. And then, a massive blur of movement. A semi-truck. It came out of the fog like a nightmare, barreling across the highway from one of those small side roads, blowing through a stop sign that was invisible in the thick mist. It didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, and it passed inches in front of them. Had she not stopped, had she even hesitated for a second, they would have been hit broadside. The truck would have plowed straight through them, sending metal and glass and bodies flying into the darkness. There wouldn't have been anything left. She sat there, frozen, hands gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles were white. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, her chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Ted was staring too, wide-eyed, his face pale in the dim light from the dashboard. The truck was gone. The road was empty again, just the fog swirling in its wake. The red glow of its taillights had already disappeared into the mist. She turned to look at Ted, still trying to catch her breath, and the words came out before she could stop them. She thanked him for shouting, for saving them, but Ted just looked at her, confused. I didn't say anything. She stared at him. She knew what she had heard. It hadn't been in her head, hadn't been some strange instinct. It had been a voice, loud and clear, right beside her. But Ted hadn't spoken. For a long time, they just sat there, the car idling in the middle of the empty highway, the silence stretching between them, heavy and unexplainable. Finally, Grandma took a shaky breath, put the car back into gear, and started driving again. She never talked about it after that. Never tried to explain it, never looked for an answer. What could she even say? That a voice had come from nowhere and saved their lives? That someone had warned her in that exact moment? She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in angels. But she believed in what had happened. She didn't tell anyone for decades. Not even my grandfather. It wasn't until she was dying, when she knew she didn't have much time left, that she told us. Maybe because she wanted us to know, maybe because she needed to say it out loud before she was gone. I remember the way she looked when she told the story. The way her eyes, tired and worn from years of life and loss, still held that flicker of something. Something like awe, something like gratitude, something like quiet understanding. She didn't try to explain it. She didn't need to, because in the end, it didn't matter where the voice had come from. It had been there, and it had saved them. I never knew the full weight of the stories in my family until I got older. Some things were spoken about in passing, just pieces of a larger picture that no one wanted to examine too closely. The way my mother told them, they were just things that happened, things that couldn't be undone, things that people moved past. But I never could. I kept turning them over in my head, thinking about how fragile everything really was. There was one story she told me when I was a teenager about a family member who lived on a farm down in Fairhope, Alabama. I'd been there once when I was young, though I don't remember much aside from the smell of wet earth and the way the wind moved through the fields like waves on the ocean. The house sat on a patch of land surrounded by soybean fields, nothing but open sky stretching in all directions. The land was flat, the kind of place where you could see a storm coming from miles away. The wife spent most of her days outside, tending to chores. That particular day, she was hanging laundry on the clothesline, letting the sheets and shirts catch the wind. It was hot, the kind of southern heat that made the air feel thick, where sweat clung to your skin before it even had the chance to dry. The sky was clear, cloudless, and above it all, her husband flew his crop duster. He had done it for years, spraying the fields in wide, careful passes, banking and turning with the skill of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He was up there that day, making his rounds over the fields, and from above, he could see her down below, moving between the laundry she had just finished hanging. She must have bent down to pick something up, a clothespin, a fallen sheet, something small. But from the air, all he saw was her body crumpled on the ground. He thought she was lying down, resting in the shade of the clothesline. And that's when he decided to scare her. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was habit. Maybe he had done it 12 times before, coming in low just to hear her yell up at him to quit fooling around. But this time, he went too low. The wheel of the plane caught her, and she died instantly. There was no trial. No one pressed charges. People called it an accident, because what else could they call it? There was no bringing her back. I remember the way my mother told it, how her voice was even like she was reading something from a history book instead of recounting a death in our own family. It stuck with me, though. The idea of being up there in that plane, thinking it was just a game, only to realize too late what had really happened. The way a single second could change everything. I imagined the silence after, the weight of it. That was one story. There was another one she told me years later about my aunt. She owned a grocery store in Mobile back in the 1940s. It wasn't anything big, just a small shop where people from the neighborhood would stop in for their essentials. The kind of place where folks knew each other by name. She had worked there for years, knew every inch of the place, the way the floorboards creaked, the way the shelves were stocked, the way the register stuck if you didn't pull the lever just right. That day, two men walked in. They asked for a pack of cigarettes. She turned to grab them, reaching up to the shelf, not thinking anything of it. That's when she felt the thump in her back. At first, she thought one of them had just bumped into her, but when she turned around, she saw one of them pulling money from the register. She must have tried to move, tried to stop them, because the next thing she knew, they were running out the door, sprinting down the street. She ran after them. She made it a good distance before she collapsed, right there in the middle of the road. She didn't know why. All she knew was that her legs stopped working, the world spun, and then there was nothing. 2 days later, she woke up in the hospital. That was when she learned the truth, about the knife, about the fact that it had been in her back the whole time, about how her lung had been punctured. She hadn't even known she was stabbed. But the thing that stuck with her the most wasn't the knife, or the pain, or even the way she had collapsed in the street. It was what came after. When she woke up, there were 24 white roses sitting beside her bed. She didn't know who had sent them, but there was a card. Don't worry. It has been taken care of. ***. She didn't need to ask. She knew who had sent them, and she knew what they meant. She never saw those two men again. No one did. When my mother told me that story, she told it the same way she told the others, without much emotion, without embellishment. Just facts, plain and simple. But I could feel the weight of it. The way things worked back then, the way things happened, the way people handled things in the dark, without asking for permission. The older I got, the more I thought about those stories. I thought about the man in the plane, the moment he realized what he had done, the way his world must have changed in the span of a second. I thought about my aunt, running with a knife in her back, not even realizing what had happened to her, not realizing until it was too late. I thought about the flowers, the message, the silence that followed. There were no questions. There were no answers. Just the weight of what happened, and the way no one ever spoke of it again. It was winter when my mother told me. We had stayed up late, the house quiet except for the hum of the heater and the occasional crackling of ice against the window. I had always known she had a rough childhood, but she rarely spoke about it. That night, something was different. She hesitated before she started, the weight of the memory pulling at her, making her voice quieter than usual. She was 13 when she ran away. Her home wasn't safe. That was all she ever said about it, but I understood enough not to ask for details. Whatever had happened in that house had been bad enough for her to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back, stepping out into the cold with no plan, no money, and nowhere to go. She just walked. She followed the road out of town, stepping over frozen slush, her sneakers soaked through, her fingers stiff in her sleeves. The highway was long and empty, stretching out into the woods on either side. She had no idea where it went. She just knew it led away. Cars passed every so often. Some slowed, some didn't. She had seen movies where people stuck their thumbs out, so she did the same, watching the headlights crest over the horizon, waiting for someone to stop. When they did, it was a relief. It was an old sedan, dark-colored, with rust along the bottom. The couple inside looked normal. That was what she remembered the most. They looked normal. The woman was older than the man, maybe in her 40s, with short brown hair and glasses. The man had sideburns and a heavy jacket. They didn't look mean. They didn't look dangerous. She climbed into the back seat. It smelled like cigarette smoke and something else she couldn't place. The woman turned around to smile at her, and she smiled back. The car pulled onto the road, tires crunching over the gravel, and they drove. She told them where she was headed. It wasn't far, just the next town over. They didn't ask many questions. The man talked about the weather, about how winter always came early. The woman laughed and agreed. It felt normal. She leaned against the window, watching the trees blur past. It was getting dark. She felt safe, at least safer than she had before. They weren't like the others, the ones who had slowed down just enough to leer at her before driving off. They weren't like the truck driver who had called her sweetheart and told her to come closer. These people were different. The ride was quiet. The hum of the tires filled the car, steady and even. The woman asked if she was hungry. She was, but she said no. She didn't want to be a burden. The man tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. The woman adjusted her scarf. They drove for maybe 20 minutes before reaching town. They dropped her off where she asked, near a gas station with a payphone outside. The woman turned to smile at her again. It was warm, like a mother's smile. Then they were gone. She never thought about them again. 2 weeks later, she saw their faces on the news. She hadn't even been watching at first. The TV was on in the background, while someone else flipped through channels. Then she saw them, their faces, the same ones that had looked so normal, so kind. They had been arrested. The newscaster's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, saying words that didn't sink in at first. A missing girl. A body. No, just a head. The rest of her was never found. They had been driving around with it in the trunk of their car. The same car she had been in. The same trunk, right behind her seat. She hadn't moved for a long time after that. She told me she had never spoken about it before. She hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to think about what could have happened if they had decided differently that night. If she had said the wrong thing. If she had reminded them of someone. If she had been too hungry and said yes when they offered to stop for food. She didn't cry when she told me, but her voice shook. I sat there, staring at her, thinking about that 13-year-old girl, frozen and tired, sitting in the back seat of a car with a severed head just feet away from her. Thinking about how close she had come to never telling this story at all. She looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Not fear, not sadness, something heavier. A quiet, unbearable understanding of how close the world had come to swallowing her whole, and how no one would have ever known. I never used to think of my neighborhood as unsafe. I had lived there for years, and while it wasn't exactly the kind of place where you left your doors unlocked at night, it wasn't a place that made you feel uneasy walking home in the dark either. I never had a reason to be scared before that night. I guess that's why I was so unprepared for what happened. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I had just left my friend's house. He lived about 5 minutes away, a short and familiar walk through mostly empty residential streets. I'd made the walk plenty of times before, sometimes even later than that. I wasn't worried. The rain had started earlier in the evening. Not heavy, just a steady drizzle that made everything damp and reflective under the streetlights. The roads shined with puddles, and I could hear the soft splash of my shoes as I walked. My hoodie was already sticking to me, the fabric clinging to my skin from the moisture in the air. I wasn't thinking about much, just the usual stuff, what I had to do the next day, random conversations from earlier in the night. The kind of mindless thoughts you have when you're walking a route you know by heart. But then, as I reached a street corner barely a minute from my front door, I heard someone behind me. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps. There was a voice, a man's voice, calling out. At first, I thought maybe I had dropped something, that he was trying to get my attention for a reason that actually mattered. I turned around. That was my first mistake. The man was on a bright yellow bike, which immediately struck me as odd. Not just because of the color, but because it didn't look like the kind of bike you'd ride in the rain. It looked cheap, maybe something stolen, and I noticed right away that he wasn't wearing a jacket despite the weather. He was drenched, his clothes clinging to him, and his face and arms had small streaks of mud. Even then, even when my gut told me something was off, I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to seem rude. Maybe because I didn't think there was any real danger. "What do you need help with?" I asked. He didn't answer me in the way I expected. No mention of a flat tire, no request for directions, no normal reason for stopping someone on the street at that hour. Instead, he just said, "Please, you must come with me." That was it. No explanation. Just that. I stood there for a second, confused. His voice had an urgency to it, like he was desperate for me to go with him, but he wasn't telling me where or why. Something felt wrong. I asked him again, more cautious this time. "What do you need help with?" Again, the same response. "Please, you must come with me." The way he said it, like a command instead of a request, made my stomach tighten. I suddenly felt very aware of how empty the street was. There were houses around us, but most of them had their curtains drawn, lights off. No cars passed by. I realized that if something happened, there was no one to see it. I took a small step backward. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me what you need." His face changed then. His eyes widened, and I saw frustration flicker across his face. His mouth twitched like he was holding back something harsher. "Just come with me," he repeated, more forcefully this time. I took another step back. "No." And that's when he grabbed me. His hand clamped around my arm, fingers digging into my sleeve. I wasn't expecting it, and for a moment I just froze. It wasn't just the grip, it was the way he pulled me toward him, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and fast. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was somewhere else. And then he started talking. His voice was fast, angry, almost like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. "Fuck you. How many languages do you speak? You won't believe the things I've seen, the brothers I've lost." I didn't know what to do. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't someone who knew how to handle this kind of situation. My body just locked up, my mind blank. All I could think about was how tight his grip was, how his nails dug into my arm like he had no intention of letting go. "Do you think I am going to hurt you?" The words felt like a warning. His face was too close, his grip too strong, his anger too sudden. I wanted to push him off, to rip my arm free, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And then, just as quickly as it started, something changed. A shadow moved on the pavement across the street. Someone was walking toward us. The moment he noticed, his grip loosened. His eyes flicked to the side, and I felt his fingers slacken just enough. I didn't think. I just ran. I yanked my arm free and bolted, my feet splashing through the puddles, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. My house was just ahead, and I ran straight to the door, fumbling with my keys, shoving them into the lock with shaking hands. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and stood there, my back pressed against the wood, my heart hammering in my chest. I was soaked, panting, my arm aching where he had grabbed me. I didn't know if he had followed me. I didn't dare check. For a long time, I just stood there listening. The rain tapped against the windows. The house was silent. Eventually, I moved to my room. I pulled off my wet clothes, staring at the faint marks on my arm where his fingers had pressed into my skin. I should have done something differently. I should have yelled for help, shoved him off me, anything. But I didn't. I just let it happen until I could run. I never saw him again after that. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't want to know. But I never walked home alone that late again. It was the kind of heat that stuck to your skin. Thick, humid, pressing. The air barely moved, and what little wind there was carried the smell of dust and exhaust. The city felt alive, buzzing, but in a way that made you keep your head on a swivel. I had been to a few places that made me feel uneasy before, but something about this place made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We had been in Africa for about a week now, me and a few colleagues, all here for work. It wasn't my first time abroad, but it was the first time I'd felt this out of place. The streets were crowded, chaotic. People moved in tight groups, eyes watching from the shadows between old buildings. The further we walked, the more I noticed how different we looked, how obvious it was that we didn't belong. We had finished our work for the day and just wanted to get back to the hotel. We had been warned not to go anywhere alone, especially not at night. That's why we had a guide, someone who knew the area, someone who could speak the language and keep us from getting into trouble. He wasn't from this exact region, but he was close enough that he could navigate it better than we ever could. The problem was, finding a taxi wasn't as easy as it should have been. There were no official taxi stands, no clean yellow cabs with meters and radio dispatchers. Just old cars, some barely holding together, their drivers watching us, waiting. We stood at the edge of the street, trying to figure out which one, if any, was a safe bet. A car pulled up, an older model sedan with dull paint and mismatched tires. The driver leaned out, a man in his 40s with a thin build, dark skin, and tired eyes. "Taxi." He gestured to the back seat. I hesitated, glancing at our guide. He was standing slightly behind us, hands in his pockets, watching. I could tell he didn't like this, but we had few options. The streets were thinning out, and the idea of standing around any longer made me uncomfortable. I stepped toward the car, opening the back door. The inside smelled of sweat and old fabric. The seat was torn, the stuffing pushing through. My colleagues climbed in, and I followed. Our guide sat up front, quiet, tense. The driver pulled away from the curb. At first, everything seemed fine. The city lights flickered past, the streets narrowing as we left the busier areas. I watched the buildings change, going from shops and restaurants to older structures, some abandoned, others barely holding on. Streetlights became less frequent, and the roads grew rougher. I glanced at my phone. The location didn't look right. The feeling in my gut grew heavier. Something wasn't right. I looked at our guide. He was staring at the driver, his face unreadable. His fingers tapped against his leg. I could see him thinking, calculating. The driver turned onto a smaller road, one that looked more like an alley than a street. My pulse quickened. This wasn't the way back. The buildings on either side were closer now, the darkness stretching longer between streetlights. My hands clenched into fists. I could feel my colleagues shifting, uneasy. Then our guide spoke. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I understood. It was low, calm, but firm. Just a few words. The driver stiffened. His hands tightened on the wheel. He hesitated. Then slowly, he pulled the car over and stopped. The silence was suffocating. The guide turned to us, his face still unreadable. Get out. We didn't hesitate. The doors opened, and we spilled out onto the street. The car idled for a moment longer. Then the driver muttered something under his breath and sped off, disappearing into the darkness. The street was empty, quiet. My heart was pounding. I turned to the guide. What just happened? He exhaled, shaking his head. He wasn't taking us back to the hotel, he said. He was taking us somewhere else. Somewhere bad. I felt a chill despite the heat. Why did he stop? What did you say to him? The guide looked down the road where the car had vanished, then back at me. He didn't know I could understand him, he said. He thought I was just another foreigner like you. I swallowed hard. He was taking us to a place where people get robbed, the guide continued. Or worse. I didn't want to ask what worse meant. I already knew. The weight of it sank into my chest. We had been minutes, maybe seconds, from something that could have gone very, very wrong. We walked back to the main road in silence. No one spoke. I think we were all processing what had almost happened. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting that car to return, to see the driver waiting for us in the darkness. But he didn't. By the time we found a real taxi, one that our guide chose carefully, I felt exhausted. The relief didn't fully hit me until we were back at the hotel, the bright lobby lights washing away the shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the way the driver's hands had tightened on the wheel, the way he hesitated before letting us go. If our guide hadn't been there, if he hadn't spoken those few words, how long would it have been before we realized we were never going back to the hotel? The next morning, over breakfast, no one said much about it. But we all knew. We had come far too close. And next time, we wouldn't be so lucky. I was driving home from the gym, exhausted but satisfied. It had been a good workout, the kind that left my muscles aching in a way that felt earned. The drive back was about 40 minutes, a long stretch of time when it was already past 3 a.m. Most people would probably take the main roads, but I preferred the back route. It was faster, quieter, and I didn't have to deal with stoplights or late-night traffic. The only downside was the lack of cell service. There were long stretches where my signal dropped to nothing, just dead zones where no calls or texts would go through. It never really bothered me before. I liked the isolation, the darkness, the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but my music and the hum of the road beneath my tires. It was a cool night, early fall, with the kind of crisp air that made me wish I had cracked the windows down a little. The road was familiar. I had driven it hundreds of times. It was a winding, two-lane road surrounded by thick tree lines, with occasional breaks where fields stretched out under the moonlight. No streetlights, no houses, just stretches of blacktop cutting through the woods. I was about halfway home when I saw it. A white Honda CR-V parked on the side of the road, facing my direction. My headlights caught it at the last second as I came around a bend, the beams gliding across its windshield and bouncing off the reflective paint. It was positioned just far enough off the road that it wasn't blocking traffic, but close enough that it wasn't completely hidden in the shadows. I immediately took interest. I had been thinking about buying a CRV for a while. I loved to hike, and my car, a Honda Civic Si, was great, but it wasn't exactly made for rough terrain. The CRV was practical, reliable, and had just enough space for everything I needed. It was almost funny how perfect the timing was. What were the chances I'd come across one just sitting there in the middle of nowhere? I slowed down as I passed it, letting my headlights illuminate the vehicle fully. There was no for sale sign, nothing taped to the windshield or written on the side. But that didn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe the owner just hadn't put a sign on it yet. I hesitated. I knew it wasn't exactly the smartest idea to stop. It was late, I was alone, and I had no way to call for help if something happened. But my curiosity got the best of me. I figured I'd turn around and check it out, just for a second. If it looked sketchy, I'd leave. I found a small pull-off up the road, did a quick U-turn, and started back toward the CRV. As I got closer, I slowed down again, my headlights sweeping over the vehicle, lighting up the front grille and the foggy windshield. That's when he stepped out from behind it. I hadn't seen him before. He must have been standing on the far side, hidden from my view when I first drove past. The moment my headlights hit him, he moved, stepping into the glow of my beams, his face suddenly fully visible in the stark white light. Something about him made my stomach drop. He was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with a thin build and an unnaturally pale face. His skin looked drawn out, almost sickly, like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were dark, loose-fitting, and slightly disheveled, as if he had been wearing them for days. But it wasn't his appearance that made my blood run cold. It was his expression. His eyes were hollow, wide open, almost bulging, like he had been caught in the middle of something he didn't want anyone to see. But there was something else there, too, something much worse. Rage. The moment he saw me, his face twisted into something almost inhuman. His mouth opened slightly, lips pulling back over his teeth, and in an instant, he sprinted toward my car, Fast. Faster than I expected. For a split second, I froze. My mind couldn't process what was happening fast enough. Why was he running at me? Was he stranded? Was he angry that I had stopped? Was he going to attack me? Then I saw his right hand move toward his pocket. Not a normal movement. Not someone reaching for a phone. This was deliberate, frantic, like he was trying to grab something, but couldn't quite get a hold of it. A weapon. A gun. A knife. Something. I didn't wait to find out. My instincts finally kicked in, and I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away. The man didn't stop. He kept sprinting toward me, his movements erratic, his free hand clawing at the air, as if he could physically rip me from my car if he got close enough. His eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of anything remotely human. I kept reversing, gripping the wheel tight, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I needed to turn around, fast. I spotted a driveway just down the road, a long dirt path leading into the woods. Without hesitation, I threw the wheel to the side and backed into it, my tires kicking up dirt as I swung my car around. I barely had time to shift back into drive before I saw his headlights flash on. The CRV roared to life. He was coming after me. I floored it. The tires screeched against the pavement, my Civic lurching forward as the speedometer shot up. I was already doing 60 before I had even cleared the bend in the road. His headlights stayed right behind me. For the next 20 minutes, he chased me, his car staying locked onto my tail, matching my every turn, refusing to let me get any distance. I ran a stop sign, blew past the only gas station in the area. I even cut across an empty intersection without looking, desperate to lose him. But he wouldn't stop. It wasn't until I saw the first streetlights of town that I finally let myself breathe. The moment I spotted the police station up ahead, I jerked the wheel to the side and skidded into the parking lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't even look back to see if he was still there. I just sat in my car, gripping the wheel, my whole body shaking. When I finally turned around, he was gone. No taillights. No sign of the CRV. Nothing. Just an empty road. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that horrible, twisted expression, those soulless eyes locked onto mine, the way his mouth curled when he ran at me. A few nights later, I was scrolling through my phone when a news article popped up. Escaped convict on the loose, considered highly dangerous. I almost dropped my phone. I clicked the article, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw the picture. It was him, the man from the CRV. He had escaped from a prison 2 counties over. He was known to be violent, erratic, and heavily addicted to meth. The report stated that he had been spotted multiple times over the last few nights, trying to flag down drivers or lure them into stopping. I slammed my phone down and sat there in silence. I knew I had been lucky. If he had gotten that weapon out in time, if I had hesitated even a second longer, I might not be here to tell this story. I don't think I ever saw a gator in that lake before that day. It was just another part of the camp, like the canoes and the old wooden cabins and the fire pit where we roasted marshmallows at night. The lake was warm and brown, the way most lakes in Florida are, with patches of lily pads floating near the shore and cypress trees dipping their roots into the water. The counselors told us not to swim too far out, but nobody really thought about why. It was just a rule, like not running in the mess hall or not sneaking out after dark. It was summer, sometime in the mid-70s. I was just a kid, but my older brother was at the same camp, which made me feel safer. He wasn't the kind of older brother who ignored me. He was tough, the kind of kid who climbed trees higher than anyone else and raced his bike down dirt roads without braking. If I was scared of something, I just had to look at him and remind myself that he wasn't scared, so I didn't have to be either. That morning had been hot, the kind of humid Florida heat that sticks to your skin. We spent most of it playing games and making crafts, waiting for the part of the day when we could go to the lake. The lake was the best part of camp. Cool water, splashing, kids screaming and laughing. Some kids had rafts, some had tubes, but my brother didn't need any of that. He just swam. I don't know what made him do it, but at some point, he ran full speed down the wooden dock and jumped. I remember the splash, how big it was, how the water swallowed him whole for just a second before he came up again. A few kids cheered. The counselors didn't mind. It wasn't against the rules to jump from the dock as long as you didn't push anyone else in. I think I looked away for a second, maybe talking to someone, maybe reaching for a rock to throw into the water, and when I looked back, everything had changed. I didn't see it at first. I heard it. A splash, different from the others, deeper, heavier, like something big had just slipped into the water. Then there was the scream, sharp, panicked, cutting through the noise of the other kids. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear when someone's playing. It was the kind that made everything stop. My brother was in the water, but he wasn't swimming anymore. He was thrashing. I could see his arms, the way he was hitting the surface, trying to keep himself up. The water around him was churning, frothy, splashing in every direction. And then I saw it, a dark shape, barely visible, the ridged back of something just beneath the surface. The gator. It had him. At first, I didn't know where, but then I saw his leg was inside its mouth. The upper part, right above the knee. The gator's head was tilted back, like it was trying to swallow his leg whole. His foot must have been deep in its throat. I don't think my brain fully understood what was happening at first. It didn't make sense. We knew there were gators in Florida. We saw them in ditches, in canals, sometimes sunning themselves on the banks of rivers. But they weren't something that happened to us. They were just there, part of the background. Kids started screaming. Some ran back toward the shore, away from the water. Others froze. But then someone picked up a rock, and another kid followed. And before I even realized what I was doing, I was throwing them too. Anything to make it stop. The first few missed, plopping uselessly into the water. My brother was still kicking, still fighting, his hands pushing at the gator's snout. But it was strong, too strong, and I could see it pulling him down. Every second he fought was a second closer to it dragging him under. Then a rock hit the gator square in the head. It flinched. Another hit its side. Then another. Kids were throwing everything, rocks, sticks, clumps of dirt. My brother was still struggling, twisting, trying to pry its jaws off his leg. I don't know if it was the rocks or if he managed to land a kick just right, but suddenly it let go. For half a second, I thought it was over. But it wasn't. My brother started swimming, half dragging himself through the water. But the gator turned, its tail sweeping through the lake, and lunged again. This time, it went for his foot. It was faster than I thought something that big could be. 1 second, my brother was almost free. The next, the gator was there, its jaws snapping shut. And then, finally, someone, an adult, was running down the dock. I remember recognizing him before I even saw his face. Our neighbor. He must have been helping out at camp, maybe fixing something or checking on the counselors. He was big, the kind of man who did hard work his whole life, and he didn't hesitate. He grabbed my brother by the arms and yanked him out of the water. For a second, I thought the gator was going to come up onto the shore after him. It didn't. It just slipped back into the lake, disappearing like it had never been there at all. My brother was bleeding. His leg was torn open, deep cuts where the teeth had sunk in. Some parts looked like they were missing. I could see the raw meat of his skin, the bright red where his flesh was pulled apart. Someone grabbed towels, pressed them against his leg. I think he was in shock. He wasn't screaming anymore, just breathing fast, his face pale, staring up at the sky. They rushed him to the hospital. Me and my younger brother weren't allowed to go. We had to wait. The camp counselors tried to keep us distracted, but I could tell they were shaken. I heard whispers, rumors spreading between kids. Some were saying the gator had almost eaten him, that it had tried to roll him under. Others said there were more gators in the lake, waiting. I told my group counselor that it was my brother, that I needed to see him, but she didn't believe me until someone came to get me. That night, my dad took us to see him. Not inside the hospital, but outside to the back window. I remember standing on my toes, looking through the glass, seeing him lying in the bed with his leg wrapped up. His face was tired, his eyes heavy. He waved at us, gave us a small smile. He came home on crutches, his leg bandaged from hip to ankle. The stitches ran in thick, jagged lines up and down his thigh, swollen and angry looking. He had to take antibiotics for weeks. For a long time, he didn't talk about it. When I asked him later what he remembered, he said not much. Just flashes. The feeling of the teeth sinking in, the water, the fight. But the part he remembered most was when they cleaned the wounds. It's been decades since then. His scars are still there. Thick, ugly things, the kind you don't forget. And that lake, they never found the gator. Maybe it moved on. Maybe it's still there. But if you ever hear someone say there's a gator in every body of water in Florida, believe them. I was 16 when I first told someone the whole story, but I still remember it like it happened yesterday. The feeling it left behind, that unease deep in my chest, has never really gone away. I was just a kid when it happened, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Old enough to know when something wasn't right, but young enough that I still questioned if my mind was playing tricks on me. Even now, I don't know exactly what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure. I was wide awake. It was a normal night, as normal as any night could be in that house. I had spent hours in my room, sitting in front of the old Xbox Classic, playing whatever game I had been obsessed with at the time. I don't remember which one it was, just that I had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the screen, the glow from the TV being the only thing lighting my room. Time had slipped away from me the way it always did when I played, and before I knew it, I glanced at the clock and saw that it was already past 2 a.m. I knew I should have gone to bed earlier. My parents always told me not to stay up too late, but they were already asleep, and I had gotten away with it before. Still, I was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion settle in my limbs, and I figured I should call it a night. I reached for the controller, hit the power button, and watched the screen fade to black. The only sound in the room was the familiar hum of my Xbox shutting down, followed by the small clicking noise it made when it powered off completely. I sat in the silence for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that only existed in the dead of night, the kind where every tiny sound felt louder than it should. I got up, switched off the light, and climbed into bed. My body sank into the mattress, and I pulled the covers up to my chin, letting out a long breath as I let the darkness settle in around me. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, just barely there, like a whisper from far away. It was the kind of sound you almost don't register at first, like the soft murmur of kids talking in class when the teacher isn't paying attention. It was so quiet that I wasn't even sure if I had actually heard anything, or if my mind was just making things up after staring at a screen for too long. I lay still, eyes open in the darkness, waiting. Then I heard it again. It wasn't as distant this time. It was subtle, but it was closer. My stomach twisted in that slow, creeping way it does when something doesn't feel right. My house was always silent at night. No one else stayed up this late. My parents' room was at the end of the hall, and I knew for a fact that their door was locked. My siblings were younger than me, and they never got up at night. That left no one else. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the wind outside, or the old pipes in the walls settling. Houses made noises sometimes. Everyone knew that. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, willing sleep to come. Then the whisper came again, and it was even closer. Every hair on my body stood on end. I don't know how to describe the feeling that took over my body, only that it was pure gut-deep dread. My chest tightened, my breath hitched, and suddenly, I was more awake than I had ever been in my life. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, my eyes open in the dark, my ears straining to hear every tiny sound. The whisper came again, clearer, closer. It wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my room. I pulled the covers over my head. It was instinct more than anything. A stupid, childish reaction, as if my blanket could somehow protect me. But I was terrified, and my body acted before my brain could catch up. I lay there, curled up beneath the fabric, my heartbeat pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I heard the whisper again. It was right next to me, and I understood what it was saying. Come into the living room. It was barely audible, just a breath of sound, but it was unmistakable. Come into the living room. I squeezed my eyes shut. Come into the living room. My fingers dug into the sheets. My body was locked in place, frozen between terror and disbelief. I knew I wasn't dreaming. I had just turned off my game. I had just gotten into bed. I had been wide awake when I first heard it. I wasn't sleeping. Come into the living room. It was right in my ear. I screamed. It wasn't just a yelp or a startled cry. It was a full-body, desperate, top-of-my-lungs scream, the kind that tore through my throat and echoed through the house. The second the sound left my mouth, the whisper stopped. The air in the room went still, like whatever had been there had vanished in an instant. My bedroom door flew open. Light from the hallway flooded in, and my mom was suddenly at my bedside, pulling the covers down and shaking me by the shoulders, asking me what was wrong. I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come out. I could still feel the whisper in my ear, could still hear it playing over and over in my head. My entire body was shaking. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally managed to tell her what had happened. I expected her to brush it off, to tell me it was just a dream, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But instead, she got quiet, really quiet. Then she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face, and after a long pause, she told me something I'll never forget. The previous owner of the house had died in the living room, and he had been there for a while before anyone found him. They had to scrape him off the floor. Even now, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. I never heard the whisper again after that night, but I always felt something in that house, like I was never really alone. The air always felt heavy in certain rooms, like something unseen was lingering just out of sight. I never stayed up late playing Xbox after that, and I never left my bedroom after dark unless I absolutely had to. I never went into the living room at night, and I never, ever will. I don't know if anyone could have seen it coming. It was just kids playing. That's all it was. Just two little girls in an empty house, making up a game to pass the time. The house itself was quiet that afternoon, a single-story place with white walls and soft carpet, the kind that made everything feel a little too still when no one else was home. Sunlight came in through the windows, catching bits of dust in the air, making the whole place seem warm, slow, like time wasn't really moving. Outside, the street was calm. It was the middle of the week, the middle of the day. Parents were at work, older kids were at school. There wasn't much sound except for the occasional car rolling past, or the distant bark of a dog in someone's backyard. Inside, the girls were laughing, the way kids do when their whole world is just the game they're playing. She was 8 years old. Smart, full of energy, always moving, always talking. She was the youngest in her family, the baby sister who followed her brothers around, picking up their habits, wanting to do everything they did. She was tough, fearless in a way that made the grown-ups shake their heads and smile. And she was talented. People said she had a gift for the water. Water skiing was her thing, the one place she could fly. She could cut across the lake like she was weightless, fast and steady, always in control. She'd won competitions. Even the older kids respected her for that. But right now, she wasn't thinking about skiing. Right now, she was just a dog. That was the game. Dogs. Her friend was the owner, and she was the dog. They'd found an old leash and collar somewhere. maybe in a drawer, maybe in a basket by the door. A real collar, the kind you'd use for an actual dog, the kind that buckled tight. And it made sense to use it, because why wouldn't it? If they were playing dogs, they needed a leash. They needed a collar. That's what dogs wore. So she let her friend buckle it around her neck, giggling as they tugged at it, testing it, pretending. It was loose enough that it didn't hurt, but snug enough to feel real. She barked, wagged an imaginary tail. She crawled around on all fours, panting like a puppy. Her friend played along, giving her commands, making her sit, making her roll over. And it was fun. For a while, they just ran through the house like that, her on the leash, her friend leading the way. They went from the living room to the hallway to the kitchen and back, pretending they were out for a walk. She'd lunge forward sometimes, yanking the leash, pretending she was a dog chasing a squirrel. Her friend would scold her, tugging her back, making her heel. Then the game changed. At some point, her friend got an idea. Dogs needed to be tied up sometimes, right? Like when you left them outside a store, or when you didn't want them running off. That's what real dog owners did. And there, in the hallway, was the perfect spot, the coat closet. It was just a small closet by the front door, one of those shallow ones with a single wooden rod for hanging jackets. The doors were open, the space empty except for a few shoes on the floor, a couple of old winter coats pushed to one side. Her friend led her inside, guiding her by the leash. The rod was the perfect height, just above her head when she was on all fours. But there was a problem. When her friend tried tying the leash to the rod, it didn't work the way they thought it would. She couldn't be on all fours and still reach it. It was too high. And a dog couldn't stand up like a person. That wasn't part of the game. So they came up with a solution. They got a stool, a small wooden one, the kind you use to reach high shelves in the kitchen. It was just tall enough that when she climbed onto it on all fours, the leash reached. Her friend tied it, making sure it was snug but not too tight. Then she stepped back, looking at her work, checking to make sure it looked right. And then, for whatever reason, she left. Maybe she got distracted. Maybe she had to use the bathroom. Maybe she just wanted to see what it looked like from farther away. Whatever it was, she walked off, leaving her friend kneeling on the stool, the leash looped around the wooden rod above her. She wasn't scared. It was just the game. She waited, staying still, being a good dog, the way she was supposed to. But then the stool tipped. Maybe she shifted her weight. Maybe one of the legs wasn't steady. Maybe the carpet made it wobble. Whatever happened, it wasn't a big movement, just enough to make it slide out from under her. And then she was falling. She didn't have time to think. 1 second, she was kneeling, waiting, playing. The next, the collar had gone tight. There was no ground beneath her. No way to reach up and undo the buckle. No way to shout for help. The leash had been tied well. She kicked. She struggled. But the more she fought, the worse it got. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. No one saw. No one heard. When her friend came back, it took a second for her to understand what she was seeing. At first, it probably just looked wrong, like something out of place. Her friend, still in the closet, but not on the stool anymore. The leash stretched tight, the way her body hung there, still. And then the reality of it hit. Panic. Fear. She ran. Didn't stop to think. Didn't check to see if she could help. Just ran. She ran out the front door, across the yard, down the sidewalk, all the way home, breathless, wild-eyed, shaking, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. And the house stayed quiet. No one came until later. Her grandmother was the one who found her. She'd come home like any other day, unlocking the door, stepping inside, expecting the usual things, the sound of kids, the feeling of warmth, the normal rhythm of home. But something was wrong. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavy. Maybe it was just instinct, the deep, unshakable sense that something wasn't right. She called out. No answer. She walked through the house, looking. And then she saw. The open closet. The stool tipped over. The body hanging there, limp and quiet, the little feet inches from the ground. There was no bringing her back. The paramedics came, but it was too late. It had been too long. Her parents came home. Her brothers came home. The house filled with people, with cries, with shock, with disbelief. But nothing could change what had already happened. It was just a game that went too far. She had been strong, fast, full of life. She had been fearless, the kind of girl who could cut through the water like she was flying. She had been too young, but none of that mattered now. Because in the end, she had only been a little girl, playing pretend. in an empty house where no one was there to save her. I grew up in a place no one ever wanted to live. A tiny, beat-up trailer sitting alone in the middle of endless grapevines, miles from anything that mattered. The kind of place you end up in when you're too broke to afford anything better. The kind of place where the walls are thin enough to hear the rats scurrying at night, where the floor sags under your feet, and where the air inside always smells faintly of mildew no matter how many times you air it out. We lived there for years, and every day I hated it. The summers were brutal. The tin roof turned the inside into an oven, the air conditioning barely worked, and there was nothing to do but stare at the dusty fields outside. Winters weren't much better. Cold drafts cut through the flimsy walls, and rain leaked through spots in the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor. But the worst part wasn't the discomfort. It was the isolation. No neighbors except for a sweet old lady down the road. No stores nearby. No streetlights. Just rows and rows of grapevines stretching as far as the eye could see, swallowing the land in every direction. The silence out there was suffocating. At night, it felt like the world ended just beyond the dirt driveway, like nothing existed outside that little bubble of darkness. I moved out in 2012. Finally, when we left, I thought I'd never have to think about that place again. We packed up, drove off, and I let myself believe it was just another miserable chapter in my life that I could close forever. But I was wrong. A father and son moved in after us. I never met them, but I heard things. Everyone who lived in that trailer was dirt poor. There was no other reason to end up there. The only upside was the surprisingly fast internet. But that didn't make up for the fact that the place was barely livable. The new tenants must have been desperate. From what I heard, they didn't have much. No real job, no steady income. They got by however they could, selling what little they had to make ends meet. At some point, they sold their car to a group of guys from Stockton. And that's when everything went to hell. I don't know what exactly was wrong with the car, but whatever it was, the buyers weren't happy. Maybe it broke down. Maybe they found out it had been in a wreck. Maybe it was barely holding together in the first place. Whatever the case, they felt cheated. They weren't the kind of people to just let that go. Somehow, they tracked down the father and son. I don't know how. Maybe through paperwork, maybe through someone in town who knew where they lived. But they found them, and they came back. It was late when they arrived. My old neighbor, the kindest woman you'd ever meet, someone who baked cookies for kids and fed stray cats, heard them arguing. The voices carried through the night air, loud and angry, the kind of shouting that made your gut twist because you just knew something bad was about to happen. She didn't see everything. She couldn't from where she was, but she heard it. The fight escalated. Yelling turned to threats. Threats turned to violence. And then gunshots. She called the cops, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The father was dead. They found his body in a ditch not far from the trailer, dumped there like garbage. No one knew if he died instantly, or if he was left there to bleed out. Maybe he was still alive when they tossed him in, staring up at the night sky, knowing no one was coming to save him. The son, whoever he was never the same after that. He left not long after. Maybe he couldn't afford to stay. Maybe he just couldn't bear to. Either way, the trailer sat empty again, just like it had been before we moved in. Only now it was different. The place had always felt miserable, but now it felt wrong. Every time I passed by it, I felt it. That eerie, empty atmosphere. The overgrown grass swallowing the driveway, creeping up the sides of the trailer. The windows dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like a place that didn't want to be lived in anymore. The silence around it was heavier than before. Not just empty, but watching. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't think the Father's spirit is haunting that place. But when something that violent happens somewhere, it leaves a mark. You can feel it. The last time I drove past, I slowed down without thinking, staring at the place through my window. For a moment, I imagined what it must have been like for him in those final moments. The fight, the fear, the way the cold night air must have felt as he lay there in that ditch, knowing he wasn't going to make it. I didn't stop. I never stop. I just keep driving, leaving that place behind me, because no one should live there anymore. I remember that day so clearly, even though I wish I could forget it. It was supposed to be a normal day, Just me and my friends hanging out at the mall, catching up, shopping, laughing, enjoying ourselves. It wasn't anything special, just a way to spend time together while they were visiting. I hadn't seen them in a while, so I wanted the day to be fun, something to look back on and smile about. I never expected it to turn into something I would look back on and shudder. It started out so normally. We met up in the late morning, grabbed some coffee from one of the little kiosks near the entrance, and then wandered from store to store, stopping wherever we felt like it. We weren't in a rush. We had no real plans, just enjoying each other's company, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. The mall was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. Just the usual weekend crowd, families with kids, teenagers running around, older couples walking hand in hand. It was familiar, safe. At some point, maybe 2 or 3 hours in, my friend said she needed to use the bathroom. None of us really had to go, but we all went with her anyway, like friends do. The bathrooms were at the far end of the mall, down a quieter hallway near the food court. We had passed them earlier in the day and barely noticed them. Just another part of the building we didn't need to think about. The hallway leading to the restrooms was noticeably quieter than the rest of the mall. There were no stores down there, just a couple of vending machines and a family lounge. The noise of the mall, music, chatter, the hum of people, faded as we walked down the hall. We stopped outside, leaning against the wall while our friend went in. We waited. At first, we didn't think anything of it. Bathrooms take time. Maybe she was fixing her makeup or scrolling on her phone. We weren't counting the minutes. We were just standing around talking, checking our own phones, glancing at people as they passed by. Then the door swung open. At first, I didn't process what I was looking at. It was my friend, but she wasn't walking. She wasn't even conscious. 2 girls, maybe in their late teens or early 20s, were carrying her. One had her under the arms, the other was holding her legs. She was completely limp between them, her head lolling to one side. I froze. For a moment, my brain couldn't catch up with what I was seeing. Then it hit me. Asterisk, asterisk, something was wrong. Asterisk, asterisk. I stepped forward. So did my other friends. There was this split second of confusion, of panic, of what the hell is going on. The 2 girls carrying her didn't look at us at first. They were walking fast, too fast, like they were in a hurry to get out of there. And then they saw us. We must have looked as shocked as we felt because the moment we spoke, demanding to know what was happening, they dropped her, just like that. As if they hadn't been carrying a human being, but something unimportant, something they didn't want anymore. She hit the ground with a dull, lifeless thud. And then they ran. I didn't even look at them as they bolted down the hall, disappearing around the corner. I was already on the ground, reaching for my friend. Her body was slack. Her face was pale. Her breathing was slow and uneven. She wasn't waking up. Panic surged through me like ice in my veins. My hands shook as I touched her face, her shoulders, trying to wake her up, but she barely reacted. My other friends were already pulling out their phones, calling for help. People started to gather around. A few bystanders had seen what happened and rushed over, asking questions we couldn't answer. I kept talking to her, saying her name over and over, hoping she'd open her eyes and tell me it was just a bad joke. But she didn't. She was barely there. The next few minutes felt like a blur. Mall security arrived first, then paramedics. They checked her vitals, shone a light in her eyes, spoke in clipped, serious tones. They asked us questions we didn't know how to answer. Asterisk, did she take anything? Asterisk. Asterisk, does she have any medical conditions? Asterisk. Asterisk, was she drinking? Asterisk. No. None of us knew what had happened. All we knew was that she went into the bathroom, and then 2 complete strangers tried to take her out like she was nothing more than luggage. The paramedics got her onto a stretcher. One of them said she had a weak pulse. Another said something about her pupils being unresponsive. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. Then the police showed up. They asked us the same question security and the paramedics had. They wanted descriptions of the 2 girls, what they looked like, what they were wearing, which way they ran. My mind was a mess, but I forced myself to remember. One had dark hair, the other was blonde. One wore a hoodie, the other had a crossbody bag. They were young, maybe the same age as us, maybe a little older. They had looked normal. Normal. That was the part that scared me the most. The cops took statements. They said they would check security footage. They promised they would find out what happened. But I could tell, just from their faces, that they had seen things like this before. That realization made my stomach turn. By the time we got to the hospital, my friend was stable but still unconscious. The doctors ran tests, and eventually, we got the answer we already suspected, but didn't want to believe. She had been drugged. They never figured out what the exact substance was. Whatever it was, it had been enough to knock her out cold. Enough that two strangers thought they could carry her out of a public place without anyone stopping them. The police never caught the girls. The mall cameras had footage, but not enough to identify them. They were careful. No clear shots of their faces, no credit card transactions to trace, nothing. Just two random people who walked into a bathroom, drugged someone, and then vanished. My friend recovered. It took days for her body to fully flush the drug out of her system, but she was okay in the end. Physically, at least. None of us were really okay after that. Something about it changed us. We didn't go to that mall anymore. Some of my friends didn't go to any malls after that. The idea of a public bathroom, somewhere we had always taken for granted as just a normal, everyday part of life, became something terrifying. And the worst part, we never got an answer. We never found out why they did it. We never found out what they wanted. And that haunts me the most. I used to live in an RV park in Gautier, Mississippi. The park, named Santa Maria, was nestled along Martin Bluff Road, a modest community where everyone knew each other's names and routines. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hum of cicadas, creating a backdrop of southern tranquility. One humid August afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the gravel paths, I noticed a new family moving into a camper a few lots down from ours. The camper was an older model, its once bright paint now faded and peeling. A boy about my age was helping unload boxes. His hair was a tousled mess, and his clothes hung loosely on his slender frame. He moved with a quiet efficiency, eyes downcast, avoiding the curious glances from neighboring residents. The next morning, as I stood at the end of the dusty road waiting for the school bus, I saw him again. He approached hesitantly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I offered a nod, and he returned it with a faint smile. We stood in silence, the only sounds being the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Over the next week, our silent companionship became a routine. We'd wait for the bus together, exchange brief glances, but words remained scarce. I learned his name was Ethan from the bus driver during roll call. He rarely spoke, and I respected his quiet nature, sensing there was more beneath the surface. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, I saw Ethan's father for the first time. He was a tall, imposing figure with a stern face etched with deep lines, perhaps from years of hard labor or unspoken burdens. His eyes were cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the evening. He rarely interacted with the other residents, often retreating into their camper, the door closing with a definitive thud. Life in the RV park was simple. Mornings were filled with the aroma of brewing coffee and the soft murmur of radios playing country tunes. Evenings brought the laughter of children playing tag and the occasional barbecue, with neighbors sharing stories and food. Despite the sense of community, there was an unspoken rule to mind one's own business, a respect for privacy that everyone adhered to. One afternoon, as the bus dropped us off at our usual spot, a thick plume of dark smoke curled into the sky from the direction of Ethan's camper. The acrid smell of burning plastic and wood filled the air, stinging my nostrils. Panic surged through me as I glanced at Ethan, whose face had turned ashen. Without a word, we both sprinted towards the source. As we rounded the corner, the sight was devastating. Flames engulfed the camper, their fiery tongues licking the sky. Neighbors had gathered, some with garden hoses, futilely trying to douse the inferno. The heat was intense, pushing us back. I saw the park manager, a stout woman with graying hair, guiding Ethan away from the scene, her face a mask of concern. "Ethan, stay with me," she urged, leading him towards the office. He followed mechanically, his eyes never leaving the burning wreckage that had been his home. I stood there, helpless, as firefighters arrived, their sirens piercing the chaotic scene. They worked swiftly, but the camper was beyond saving. Whispers spread through the crowd about the cause of the fire, but no one had any concrete answers. That evening, I returned home, my mind heavy with worry for Ethan. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale, eyes red from recent tears. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of sorrow and apprehension. "Mom, "Did you hear about the fire?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "There's more, honey. Ethan's mother, she's missing." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Missing? How? When? Apparently, she was last seen this morning. No one knows where she is. The police are involved now. A cold chill ran down my spine. The pieces didn't fit together, and a sense of dread settled in my stomach. The following days were a blur of police cars, questioning neighbors, and a palpable tension that gripped the RV park. Ethan stayed with the park manager, his demeanor more withdrawn than ever. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the barrier of unspoken words and his isolating silence held me back. One evening, as the cicadas sang their mournful tune, I overheard a conversation between my parents. Their voices were hushed, but the thin walls of our camper did little to muffle the words. "They found her," my father said, his tone grave. "Where?" my mother whispered. "Near the old gas station off the highway. It was brutal. She was tortured, burned, and decapitated." A gasp escaped my mother's lips. "And the husband?" "Arrested. They believe he found out she was giving money to someone, and he snapped." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The horrific details painted a gruesome picture in my mind. The thought of Ethan, oblivious to the fate of his mother, tore at my heart. Days turned into weeks. The once lively atmosphere of the RV park was now overshadowed by the tragedy. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, casting sympathetic glances towards Ethan, who remained a ghostly presence, drifting silently from place to place. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone on a weathered picnic bench near the playground, staring blankly at the ground. Summoning my courage, I approached and sat beside him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." He didn't respond, his eyes hollow and distant. I wanted to tell him everything, to let him know the truth, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat with him, offering the only support I could, my silent companionship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, I made a silent vow. I would be there for Ethan, in whatever capacity he needed, for as long as it took. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with pain, but I hoped that, together, we could navigate the darkness and find a glimmer of light. I was 10 years old the summer my grandmother took me to visit my uncle in upstate New York. It was the 1980s, though I don't remember exactly which year. My memories of that time are scattered, small flashes of the long car ride up, my grandmother humming along to the radio, the smell of roadside diners when we stopped to eat. But I do remember the house. It sat on a quiet road, with dense woods on one side and an old cemetery on the other. It wasn't a big cemetery, not like the ones with rows and rows of polished marble headstones. This one was small, uneven, the ground covered in thick grass that grew up between the leaning, moss-covered stones. Some of the markers were so worn down that the names had almost disappeared. Others had cracks running through them, as if they had barely survived more than a century of harsh winters and forgotten upkeep. The house itself wasn't much, just a simple, weathered building with chipped white paint and a sagging porch. My uncle lived there with a few other guys, but during the day, when they were all off at work, it was just me and my grandmother. It was quiet then, peaceful in a way that made the place feel almost separate from the world. I spent most of my time on the porch, sitting in this old wicker swing chair that hung from the ceiling by thick chains. It had a dome shape, almost like a nest, and I would curl up inside it with comic books, swinging gently back and forth while the summer air wrapped around me. The chair creaked with every movement, a rhythmic sound that blended into the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of cicadas. Some days, the air would feel heavy, thick with humidity. Other days, a cool breeze would drift through the trees, stirring the leaves and carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I remember the way the sunlight dappled the porch floor through the trees, how the shadows shifted as the day passed, stretching and shrinking like slow-moving tides. It was on one of those quiet, uneventful afternoons that I first saw him. Through the screen door, I caught a glimpse of a man sitting on the couch inside the house. He was wearing a black and red flannel shirt, his thick black hair slightly unkempt, a full beard covering the lower half of his face. He was just sitting there, relaxed, like he belonged. I didn't think much of it. My uncle had roommates, and people were always coming and going. It wasn't unusual to see someone new hanging around. I finished the comic I was reading, set it aside, and decided to go inside to grab another one. When I stepped through the door, the couch was empty. At first, I figured he must have gotten up and gone to another room. The house wasn't that big, but there were still plenty of places someone could go without me noticing. I walked down the short hallway, glancing into the bedrooms and the kitchen, but no one was there. The place was completely still, the air inside cool compared to the heat outside. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint sound of my grandmother moving around in the back room, humming to herself as she folded laundry. I felt a slight chill, but I shook it off. I was 10. I wasn't the type to get spooked over nothing. I figured maybe I had just imagined the guy, or maybe I had seen a reflection in the screen door, some weird trick of the light. I went back to the porch, picked up another comic, and forgot about it. The rest of the summer passed in a blur of lazy afternoons and long, quiet evenings. My uncle and his roommates would come home from work, and the house would fill with the sound of voices, laughter, the clatter of dishes as they made dinner. I liked listening to them talk, even if I didn't always understand what they were laughing about. They seemed older, but not like adults. More like grown-up kids, the kind that could do whatever they wanted. I never told anyone about the man in the flannel shirt. Not because I was scared, but because it didn't seem important. I never saw him again, and after a while, the memory faded into the background, just another small, meaningless moment in a long summer of quiet days. Then, more than 40 years later, I found out the truth. It was a family dinner, one of those rare occasions when everyone got together in the same place. My uncle had come down to visit, and we were all sitting around a table at some restaurant, eating and talking about the past. At some point, the conversation drifted to that old house in upstate New York. My uncle started reminiscing about the place, talking about the cemetery, the weird layout of the house, the way it always seemed a little too quiet. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. He started telling us about the ghost stories. Not in a serious way. He was laughing as he talked, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he had ever put any stock in that kind of thing. He mentioned how one of his roommates had moved out after seeing two kids outside the kitchen window, motioning for her to come out and play. How, when she went outside to look for them, she found nothing but two small grave markers, the names so old and worn that they were barely readable. Then he talked about the man. I used to see him all the time, he said, still smiling, always out of the corner of my eye, sitting on the couch while I was watching TV. Every time I turned to look at him, he'd be gone. I had been in the middle of eating when he said that. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the plate. My jaw went slack, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I must have gone pale because everyone suddenly looked at me with concern, asking if I was okay, if I needed to step outside. It took me a minute to gather myself, to find the words to explain why I had reacted like that. And when I finally told them about the man I had seen sitting on that same couch, wearing the same flannel shirt, with the same thick black hair and beard, the table fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. My uncle just stared at me, his face unreadable. When he finally did speak, his voice was quieter than before. Huh. That was all he said. Just huh. We never talked about it again. It wasn't that we were scared. Neither of us had ever felt anything bad in that house. The man, whoever he was, hadn't done anything. He had just been there, like a shadow lingering in the corner of a place long forgotten. But still, after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Not because I thought he was a ghost, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in more than 40 years, I realized that maybe, just maybe, some things in life don't have an explanation. And maybe they don't need one. I was 13 years old when my father was found dead in his apartment. It was January 15, 2012. He had been lying there for nearly a month before someone finally noticed. I don't remember exactly how I felt when I first heard the news. Shock, maybe. A strange, hollow numbness. I had barely seen him in the years leading up to his death. He had been an alcoholic, drinking himself into isolation, and by the time I started thinking about reconnecting, it was too late. They say you never forget where you were when you hear life-changing news. I was sitting at the dinner table with my mother and stepfather when she got the call. My stepfather was quiet, shoveling food into his mouth like nothing had happened. My mother's hands trembled as she listened. Then she broke. The sobs were instant, sharp, and painful to hear. I should have felt something stronger, but I just sat there, watching tears fall from her face and into the spaghetti bolognese she had made. A part of me had already accepted that I would never have a normal relationship with my father. He had been gone in one way or another for a long time. His absence had already shaped my life. The real horror wasn't that he had died. It was that he had been alone in that apartment for a month before someone realized he was missing. That's what stayed with me. The idea that someone could disappear so completely that no one even noticed. For days after that dinner, my mother sat at the same table and cried again. But this time, it wasn't about my father. She had gone in for a routine mammogram. I barely understood what that meant at the time, but I knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the room. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from me, shaking. I thought she was still crying over my father. My stepfather was next to me, silent. I asked her if she was okay. She wasn't. She told me they had found something in her right breast. Cancer. I don't remember how I reacted. I think I just stared at the bookshelf behind her. My brain refused to process it. For days ago, I lost my father. Now my mother might be dying too. It wasn't until later that I found out her chances of survival were only 40%. I watched her get weaker with every treatment. The radiation took her hair first. She had been so careful with her appearance before, always neat, always put together. But the chemo didn't care. It stripped everything away. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, in the way her skin paled, in how her body shrank inside her clothes. I remember thinking she looked so small, so fragile, like a different person. But she survived. Somehow she made it through. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. I have an older brother. These days, he's a drug addict. Back then, he was just lost. He spent that New Year's Eve partying in his apartment with his girlfriend and some friends. My mom, my stepfather, and I were there too. I remember feeling completely out of place, surrounded by drunk people, wishing I were anywhere else. At some point, my brother walked past me. He had been ignoring me all night, which wasn't unusual. But then suddenly he stopped. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was seeing something I couldn't. He stared at me for a few long seconds before he said something that still haunts me. Call your father. I don't know why I listened to him. I had no real contact with my father at that point. I wanted to rebuild something, sure, but I didn't expect anything. Still, I pulled out my phone and called. It went to voicemail. His voice was there, recorded, waiting. That was the last time I ever heard it. I would later find out that my father was already dead when I made that call. He had been dead for weeks. He was lying in that apartment, rotting, while I stood in my brother's living room, listening to his voice on a machine. I don't know how my brother knew. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. I went there once. After they found his body, after the coroner took him away, someone had to go to his apartment. Someone had to clean up. I don't know why I went. Maybe I needed to see it for myself, to make it real. The smell hit me first. Even though the body was gone, the stench of death clung to the walls. I felt it in my throat, thick and suffocating. The air was heavy, stale, like the room itself had been abandoned for longer than a month. His couch was still there. That's where he had spent his last days. That's where he died. He was 49. His organs had failed him. Alcoholism, they said. He drank himself to death. I remember standing there, looking at that couch, trying to imagine his last moments. Did he know he was dying? Did he feel it creeping in, or did it just happen? Was he scared? Was he alone? I didn't stay long. I couldn't. My stepfather was a drunk too. Not the kind who drank quietly, who passed out on the couch and stayed there. No, he was the kind who let his rage take over, the kind who made every night a war zone. He had been like that since 2010. He kept going until 2017. 7 years of screaming. 7 years of broken glass, of overturned furniture, of police visits that never changed anything. 7 years of my mother making excuses for him. She lost her hair, and he still hit her. I fought him at first. That didn't work. Then I fought my mother, trying to make her see, trying to make her leave. That didn't work either. Eventually, I just felt trapped. The worst part wasn't the nights he came home drunk and violent. It wasn't the bruises or the shattered dishes or the sound of my mother sobbing. It was the waiting, lying in bed, staring at the strip of light under my door, listening for his footsteps, for my mother's voice, for the sound of something breaking. It was knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. The police stopped coming after a while. They gave up. So did I. No one ever asked how I was doing. No one ever cared about what all of this was doing to me. But somehow I made it through school. I graduated at the top of my class. On the night of my graduation, I stood in front of an audience and gave a speech. I talked about the things we don't see, the things we ignore. I was screaming for help, but no one heard me. Everyone congratulated me afterward, smiling, shaking my hand, telling me how inspiring my words were. My mother left the room before I even finished speaking. She knew what I was talking about. That night, I decided I couldn't stay. I left everything behind. I moved 20,000 kilometers away to Australia, as far from home as I could get. It's been years now. I've built a life here. People who meet me now don't know where I came from. They don't know what I've seen. They don't know that some nights, I still wake up expecting to hear glass breaking, that I still see my father's couch in my dreams. They don't know that part of me will always be 13 years old, sitting at that dinner table, watching my mother's tears fall into her spaghetti, realizing for the first time that life doesn't care if you're ready for it or not. Because it isn't fair, and it never will be. But I survived. That has to count for something. I don't think I'll ever know what could have happened that night if I'd reacted differently. I think about it more often than I want to, about how small choices can change everything, about how the wrong kind of fear can be dangerous. It was 2004, and I was living in a second-floor apartment in Texas with my roommate. We were both in our 20s, both working and doing what we could to enjoy that strange space between being young and feeling like an adult. The apartment wasn't anything fancy. It was just a simple two-bedroom unit in a basic complex. Beige walls, thin carpet, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors through the vents and knew when someone down the hall had burned their dinner. The living room had a sliding glass door that led out onto a small balcony. It wasn't huge, just enough for a couple of chairs and a potted plant I kept forgetting to water. The complex had metal staircases that led up to the second-floor units, but the balconies didn't have any built-in ladders or anything. It never occurred to me to worry about someone climbing up. It seemed too high, too inconvenient. It was a warm night. I remember that. Warm enough that I'd left the balcony door open to let in the breeze, hoping it would cool the apartment down a little. My roommate had already gone to bed, and I was alone in my room. The bedroom was small, just enough space for a bed, a dresser, and a small desk shoved against the wall. My cat was somewhere in the apartment, probably curled up in the living room or watching the world from the balcony. I wasn't asleep yet. The lights were still on. I was lying on my side, facing the door, comfortable, relaxed, not thinking about anything important. I was aware of the soft sounds of the apartment, the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the building settling. Then I heard something different. It wasn't loud, just the softest push of the bedroom door opening. It was the kind of sound that wouldn't normally mean anything, something I wouldn't have even noticed if I'd been asleep. I assumed it was my cat coming into the room. That had happened before. The door never latched properly, so if it wasn't fully closed, it would just drift open with the weight of a push. I waited, expecting to feel the familiar weight of my cat jumping onto the bed, but nothing happened. I glanced up, and there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. I don't know how to explain what happened in my mind at that moment. It was as if my brain just refused to catch up. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. He wasn't supposed to be there, so for a few seconds, my mind just rejected the whole thing outright. I stared at him. He stared at me. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just lay there, my body locked in place, trying to understand what was happening. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't lunging toward me. He just stood there, looking down at me, his posture strange, like he was waiting for something. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe a second. Maybe 10. Then I spoke. I don't know why I said anything. Maybe because silence felt worse. Maybe because I thought, somehow, that making this a conversation instead of a confrontation would keep me safe. I asked, "What are you doing here?" His mouth opened immediately, words spilling out too fast for me to catch all of them. Spanish. My brain struggled to keep up. I spoke some Spanish, not fluently, but enough to pick up words and phrases. Enough to get by. He was saying something about trust. That I could trust him. That he wasn't going to hurt me. I didn't believe him. I sat up slowly. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I kept my face blank. I kept my voice even. I stood up. He didn't move. I took a step forward, forcing myself to keep breathing, forcing my body to stay calm. He wasn't acting aggressive. He wasn't reaching for me. He was still talking, his words fast, insistent. I nodded, pretending to listen. Then I gestured toward the door, the one that led to the living room. He hesitated. I nodded again, trying to look calm, trying to seem like I wasn't panicking. "Come on," I motioned, my voice still steady somehow. And he followed me. I walked through the apartment, feeling every single step, feeling how open everything was, how close he was behind me. He was still talking, but I wasn't processing it anymore. I could only think about the front door, about the lock, about the handle that suddenly felt a million miles away. I reached for it, turned it, pulled it open. I stepped aside, motioning for him to go. And he did. He walked out, still talking, his voice never changing, never rising. He didn't fight. He didn't hesitate. He just stepped onto the landing, and I closed the door behind him. I locked it. I stood there, my hands still on the knob, my breath caught in my throat. And then I ran to the balcony door. It was open, just like I'd left it. The realization hit me all at once. He had climbed up. I stood there, staring at the railing, at the dark night beyond it. My stomach clenched. The second floor wasn't that high, but it wasn't low either. He had pulled himself up over the edge, climbed up onto my balcony, stepped inside my home like he had every right to be there. I slammed the door shut, locked it, checked it again, just to be sure. My body started to shake. My hands, my legs, my entire frame trembling, so hard I thought I might collapse. I went back to my room, my brain still refusing to fully catch up, still trying to understand how close I had been to something I didn't even want to think about. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I told my roommate. I told a few people. They were horrified, of course. Told me how lucky I was, told me I should call someone. I didn't know what to say to that. What could I even report? He hadn't attacked me. He hadn't hurt me. He hadn't even tried to force me to do anything. But that didn't make it okay. That didn't make it any less terrifying. I started locking the balcony door after that. Every night. Every time I left the room. Every time I left the apartment. It became a ritual, a reflex. But I never stopped wondering. Who was he? Why was he there? What would have happened if I had screamed? If I had fought? If I had reacted with panic instead of control? I'll never know. And that's what scares me the most. I was too young to understand just how dangerous the world really was. When you're little, you don't think about things like crime or bad people. You don't think about what could happen if you're left alone in a car at 4 in the morning. You just follow what your parents tell you, listen to your older siblings, and sleep when you're tired. That's all I was thinking about that night, sleep. Nothing more. My parents worked delivering newspapers to the neighborhoods near ours, and they had been doing it for as long as I could remember. Every night, they'd wake up long before the sun, pack up stacks of papers, and head out to drop them off at houses and businesses. My 2 older sisters and I were always asleep when they left, but for some reason, they didn't want to leave us alone at home that night. Maybe it was a gut feeling, or maybe they had heard about something happening nearby. Some crime, some break-in, something that made them feel uneasy about leaving 3 sleeping kids alone in the house. Whatever it was, they decided to bring us with them. I didn't fight it. I was too groggy to care. I remember the cold air hitting me as they woke us up. It was still dark out, and everything felt strange, the way things do when you wake up at a time you're not supposed to. I barely even opened my eyes as I was shuffled into the car. I think my sisters were a little more awake than me, but I could barely keep my head up. The exhaustion weighed down on me like a blanket, and the second I curled up in the back seat, I passed out again. I don't know how long I slept. Could have been minutes. Could have been an hour. All I know is that I went from complete unconsciousness to total confusion in an instant. I woke up to screaming. Not just any screaming, the kind that yanks you out of sleep so violently that your heart starts pounding before your brain even catches up. My whole body jolted awake, and for a moment, I didn't even understand where I was. The car was moving. The car wasn't supposed to be moving. My parents weren't inside. It was supposed to be parked, sitting still, but it wasn't. It was going fast. Too fast. And my sisters were screaming. I turned my head, still groggy, still confused, trying to figure out what was happening. And that's when I saw him. A man. I could barely see his face in the dim streetlights passing by, but I knew he wasn't my dad. I knew he wasn't supposed to be in the driver's seat. The car jerked as he tried to keep control of it, and something heavy slid across the floor, newspapers. We always had them in the car, stacked up and bundled tight, ready to be delivered. Then I realized what was happening. Someone had stolen the car, with us inside it. I froze. My whole body locked up, and my brain refused to process it. It didn't make sense. Things like this didn't happen to people like us. They happened in movies. They happened on the news. Not to me. Not to my sisters. Not in our town. Not in our parents' car. But it was happening. And then something happened that I think saved us. My oldest sister, who had been screaming, suddenly shot up from her seat. She must have been asleep like me, but she had woken up faster, understood faster. I saw her move forward, trying to get a better look at the driver. The car swerved slightly as the man noticed her. He hadn't known we were there. He had stolen the car thinking it was empty, just an easy target, sitting in a parking lot in the middle of the night. But now, there were 3 kids in the back, one of them screaming right in his ear. She screamed again, and this time the man panicked. I saw his shoulders jolt, his head snapped to the side. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't prepared for this. And then the stack of newspapers, maybe he had kicked them, maybe he had knocked them over when he moved, tipped forward, spilling onto his lap, his arms, the floor beneath his feet. I think that's what did it. He must have realized he wasn't going to get away with this. The car jerked hard, too hard, and suddenly, it wasn't moving anymore. The tires screeched against the pavement, the smell of burnt rubber filling the air as the car came to a violent stop. The door flung open, and he was gone, just like that. For a second, everything was quiet. Too quiet. It was like the whole world had stopped along with the car. Then the reality of what had just happened crashed down on all of us. My mom was there. My dad was there. My sisters were crying. My mom was crying. And I just sat there, not knowing how to react. The police came. There were questions, lots of them, but I barely remember what was said. I was too young to fully grasp what had almost happened. At the time, it was just something that had happened in the middle of the night. Something weird, something scary, but not something I understood the way my parents did. I didn't understand until I got older, until I thought about how easy it would have been for him to keep driving. How easy it would have been for him to take us somewhere we'd never be found. How, if my sister hadn't woken up when she did, I might not be here to even tell this story. It still unsettles me to think about it. How close I was to disappearing without ever knowing it was happening. I don't know what happened to that man. I never saw his face clearly, and I never found out if the police caught him. But I still think about him sometimes, and I wonder if he ever thinks about us. Physics was never my favorite subject, but it was a requirement, and I was stuck with it. The last class of the day. The final stretch before freedom. That's what it always felt like. Just one more lecture, one more problem set, and then I could get in my car and head home. The classroom smelled of old textbooks and stale coffee. A projector hummed in the background as the professor scrawled equations across the whiteboard, his voice a steady drone. I wasn't paying much attention. My eyes kept drifting to the clock mounted high on the wall, ticking away at an agonizingly slow pace. It was a beautiful day outside. The sun was bright, the sky was a deep, endless blue, and I wanted to be anywhere but stuck in that classroom. My fingers tapped against the desk in impatience. I checked my watch again. 5 minutes to go. My stomach growled softly. I knew my mom would have supper waiting when I got home. She always did. A home-cooked meal, after a long day of classes, was one of the few things that kept me going. The final few minutes dragged on, but eventually, the professor dismissed us. I shot out of my seat before he had even finished erasing the board. The parking lot was nearly empty when I reached my car. Most students had already left, their days ending much earlier than mine. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and let the familiar hum of the engine settle me. I had a 20-mile drive ahead of me, mostly along quiet country roads. It wasn't a bad drive, peaceful, even. I had driven it countless times, knew every turn, every dip in the road, every high point where I could get a clear CB radio signal. I was a CB and electronics enthusiast. It was a hobby I had picked up years ago. I had a radio set up in my car, and I used it to check in with my family on the way home. A simple call to let them know I was on my way. It was a habit, something I did without thinking. As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, I reached for the radio mic. The first high point of my drive was just ahead. I keyed the mic and called home. No answer. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes the signal didn't carry well, or my family was in another room and didn't hear the radio. I wasn't concerned. I'd try again at the next high spot. The drive was smooth, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the fields. Late summer, the air still warm, but carrying the first hints of autumn. I reached the second high point and tried again. Still no answer. That was a little odd. My family never missed a call. It had become part of our routine. Even if they were busy, someone would always pick up. I reached the third high spot. Nothing. A quiet unease settled over me. Maybe something was wrong with my radio. I adjusted the knobs, checked the connections, but everything seemed fine. The signal should have been strong. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky as I neared the final stretch of my drive. My town came into view from the top of the last hill. From this vantage point, I could see almost everything: the rooftops, the water tower, the narrow streets. I called home again. Nothing. At this point, my stomach was tight with unease. I kept calling the entire way down the hill, right up to my driveway. That's when I saw it. The front door was wide open. I hit the brakes hard. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stared at the house. From where I sat in the car, I could see straight through the living room to the back door, which was also open. Something was wrong. I killed the engine, threw open the door, and sprinted inside, calling for my mom, for anyone. Silence. The house was empty. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the fact that no one was there. The furniture was undisturbed. The TV remote was in its usual spot. A book lay open on the coffee table, as if someone had just been reading it. But there was no sign of my mother, no sound of dinner cooking in the kitchen, no distant hum of the radio. I ran through the house, checking every room, my pulse pounding in my ears. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. My mother never left the doors open like this. If she had gone out, the doors would have been locked. The house would have been secure. I ran out the back door, my breath coming in short bursts. And there she was, standing in the yard, hanging laundry on the clothesline, as if nothing was wrong. Relief washed over me so hard I felt weak. I walked toward her, my chest still heaving, trying to make sense of everything. She looked at me, surprised, and said something that made my stomach twist all over again. "You're home early." I shook my head, checked my watch. No, I wasn't. I had left at the normal time. My physics class had ended as usual. I had driven straight home. But something was off. We went inside. I checked the wall clock, then the one in the kitchen, then the one in the living room. They were all nearly 2 hours behind my watch. I checked the microwave, the stove, every single clock in the house, all behind. It didn't make sense. My watch had been in sync with the classroom clock when I left. I was sure of it. There hadn't been a power outage. If there had been, the clocks would have reset, not just fallen behind. And even if they had lost time, why would every clock in the house be exactly the same amount off? The only explanation was that my watch was wrong. But how? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall. I had somehow arrived home over an hour before my physics class had even ended. I went over everything again and again in my head. The drive was 20 miles. I hadn't taken any shortcuts. I hadn't sped. I hadn't lost time. I had been awake, alert, conscious of every turn. And yet I was here. I wondered what would happen if I pulled up at my usual time. Would I see myself arrive? Would I cease to exist? Or had something already happened that I couldn't understand? I never found an answer. To this day, I've gone over every possibility, every logical explanation, and nothing fits. There is no missing time, no blank space in my memory, only the impossible fact that I got home before I should have. I don't know what drew us to that place. Maybe it was the price, maybe it was the location. Maybe we were just too trusting, thinking a quiet getaway in Mexico would be nothing but relaxation and good food, an escape from the routines back home. I don't remember the name of the hotel anymore, and I don't want to, but I can still see every detail of it. The building was old, not run down exactly, but tired in a way that was hard to describe. The walls were thick, the kind of thick you see in older Spanish-style buildings, meant to hold in the cool air and block out the heat. The place sat on a stretch of road that didn't seem to get much traffic, and when we pulled up, it was quiet. Too quiet. There was no one outside, no movement at all. The entrance was wide open, like it was welcoming us in. But there was something unsettling about it, something I should have noticed. When we walked inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not bad, just stale. The air had that lifeless quality, like a house that had been shut up too long. The lobby was clean but empty. A single desk sat near the far wall, and behind it was a man who barely looked up when we came in. No bellhop, no other staff. No guests sitting around reading, no tourists checking in. Just us. The man at the desk was polite enough. Gave us a key without much small talk, just the basics. Room number, breakfast hours, which we'd later find out didn't matter. Checkout time. His voice was flat, like he'd done this 100 times, but didn't expect us to stay. He didn't smile, not once. We took our bags and walked down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The floor was made of tile, cool underfoot, the kind that makes every sound seem sharper. The hallway stretched out long in front of us, lined with heavy wooden doors, all closed. Not a single sign of life. No muffled voices behind the doors, no TV sounds, no music. Just silence. Our room was in the far corner. The key was old-fashioned, the heavy brass kind you don't see much anymore. When we turned it, the lock clicked too easily, like it had been oiled recently, but never used. Inside, the room was simple. A bed, a wooden dresser, a small table with 2 chairs. A bathroom with an old mirror that had started to lose its silver in places, leaving dark patches like bruises. The windows were shut tight, the thick curtains drawn closed. When I pulled them back, the view was nothing special, just the side of another building, blank and gray. I remember looking around, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the quiet. Hotels are never truly silent. Even in the middle of the night, there are always sounds, doors closing, distant conversations, the hum of vending machines, footsteps in the hall. Here, there was nothing. We settled in, unpacked a little. The bed was stiff, the sheets clean but thin. We left the room after a while, walked around town, had dinner. The streets were normal, filled with the usual movement of locals and tourists, the sounds of laughter and conversation. Nothing felt strange out there. But when we returned to the hotel, the silence swallowed us again. It was like stepping into another world, one that had been forgotten. The first night, I slept fine. My wife didn't. I could tell in the morning by the way she moved, the tired drag in her steps. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded. The second night, I woke up once to use the bathroom. When I came back to bed, I thought I heard something in the hall. Just a faint noise, like fabric brushing against the wall. But when I listened harder, there was nothing. I told myself it was nothing. The third night is when it happened. I woke up because the light was on. Not the overhead light, just a small flashlight, the beam pointed straight at the door. My wife was sitting up in bed, her breathing slow but sharp, controlled but tense. In her hand was a can of pepper spray. I didn't move at first. I just let my eyes adjust, taking in the way she was staring, the way she was gripping the can. Then carefully I sat up too. The room felt colder than it should have. Not freezing, just off. Like the air had shifted in some way I couldn't explain. I listened, trying to pick up whatever had scared her, but all I heard was my own breathing. I didn't ask her what was wrong. I didn't need to. I could see it in her face. She was convinced someone was coming through that door. We stayed like that for a long time, just staring. My eyes kept drifting to the gap at the bottom of the door, half expecting to see shadows move across it, to hear the knob turn. But nothing happened. Eventually, the flashlight started to shake in her hand, not from fear, but from how long she had been holding it. I reached over slowly, took it from her, turned it off. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, we were packed. We didn't talk about it, didn't try to rationalize it. We just knew we weren't staying. At the front desk, the same man was there, his expression blank. He didn't ask why we were leaving early. He just took the key, nodded once, and went back to whatever he was doing. We got in the car, pulled out onto the road, and didn't look back. Later, when we told the story to someone in town, their face changed immediately. Not surprise, understanding. Like they already knew. That hotel, they told us, wasn't really a hotel. Not anymore. It was a front, a laundering scheme, some kind of cover operation. The only people who ever stayed there were the ones who didn't know better. The locals avoided it. Anyone from the area knew to stay far away. We had been the only ones there, because we weren't supposed to be there at all. I don't know what would have happened if we had stayed. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. Maybe we had just spooked ourselves over nothing. But I still remember the way she held that can of pepper spray, her knuckles white, her body rigid. She knew. Before either of us had any real reason to, she knew. And we left before we could find out why. I don't remember exactly when I first heard it. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It wasn't something that stood out right away, just a faint sound, easy to brush off. It would happen late at night, when everything was still and quiet, when I was winding down from the day. Sometimes I'd be lying in bed, scrolling on my phone or listening to music, and I'd hear it. A voice. Singing. Soft at first, just a gentle hum in the background, like someone playing music in another room. I thought it was my headset the first time, maybe some interference from the Xbox. I pulled it off and listened. Nothing. Then I checked my record player, even though it wasn't plugged in. Nothing. I picked up my phone. Nothing. The radio. Nothing. But I could still hear it. Some nights, it was clearer than others. A slow, rhythmic tune like a lullaby. A man's voice. No words, just drawn-out notes, stretching and fading into the quiet. It sent chills down my spine, but I always found some way to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor was playing music outside. Maybe it was a weird trick of the wind. Maybe I was just imagining things. Then came the thumping. It started small, just a dull, distant knock. I didn't think much of it at first. Houses settle. Wood shifts. Pipes creak. But this wasn't the normal kind of noise a house makes at night. It was steady, purposeful. Sometimes it would happen right when the singing stopped, a single knock beneath my floorboards. Sometimes it would come in pairs, like a heartbeat. Thump, thump. The first time I really paid attention to it, I was sitting on the couch, playing a game with my headset on. I took a sip of my drink, and that's when I heard it, muffled but close. I paused the game and listened. Thump. It came from beneath me. I stood up slowly. My living room had a crawl space underneath, just a couple of feet of empty space between the floor and the earth. I had never thought much about it before. It was just there, a forgotten part of the house. I moved toward the kitchen, listening. Thump. It was beneath the floor again. I told myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A stray cat. Something had probably gotten in. But the thing is, the thumping wasn't random. It wasn't the scurrying of tiny feet or the scratching of claws. It was deliberate, measured, like someone knocking. I tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. Every few nights, I'd hear it again. Sometimes the singing, sometimes the thumping, sometimes both. I thought about checking the crawl space, but every time I considered it, I found an excuse not to. The entrance was outside, hidden behind a bush. It had probably been sealed shut for years. If an animal had gotten in, I'd deal with it eventually. Then one night, my dog lost her mind. I had just crawled into bed, still hearing the faint hum of singing beneath me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone, when suddenly she bolted into my room. She wasn't just barking, she was snarling, growling deep in her throat, her ears pinned back. She lunged toward the floor, pawing at the carpet, digging furiously. Every hair on my body stood up. I grabbed her by the collar and pulled her away, dragging her out of the room. She was still barking, trying to twist out of my grip, her whole body tense. My heart was hammering in my chest. I shoved her into the hallway and shut the door, then stood there, breathing heavily, listening. Silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was thick, heavy, like something was waiting. I grabbed my gun. I sat on my bed with my rifle across my lap, my dog whining outside my door. I stayed like that all night, gripping the gun so tightly my fingers ached. The house was dead silent now, not even the creak of settling wood. I kept waiting for something to happen. A sound, a movement, but nothing came. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, still holding the rifle. When I woke up, the sun was rising. My back ached from sleeping upright, my fingers stiff from gripping the gun all night. My dog was curled up outside my door, ears twitching as she slept. I felt drained, but more than that, I felt done. I needed to check the crawl space. I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The yard was quiet, the trees standing still. I walked along the side of the house, toward the overgrown bush that covered the crawlspace entrance. I grabbed a pair of clippers from the shed and started cutting. The branches were thick, but I worked quickly. I had a sick feeling in my stomach, a deep, crawling dread. When I finally cleared the bush away, I saw it, a wooden door, old and weathered with a rusty latch. My hands were shaking as I unlatched it. The door creaked open. A damp, musty smell hit me. I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it inside. The space was cramped, barely tall enough for someone to crawl through. The dirt floor was uneven, littered with leaves and debris. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. There was a makeshift bed, just a wooden pallet with blankets piled on top. Next to it, a teddy bear, a trash bag filled with clothes, a pile of Legos, and a bunch of shoes. My shoes. Shoes I had thrown away months ago. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. Someone had been living here, right beneath me, listening, watching. Then I turned my head and saw the camera. It was small, barely noticeable in the dim light, propped up on a stack of bricks. I picked it up with trembling hands and backed out of the crawl space, slamming the door shut. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I went inside, grabbing my old laptop. I plugged in the camera and opened the files. The first video played. The screen was dark at first, then shifted as the camera moved, showing trees. My trees. Someone was walking through the woods, the camera bobbing with each step. The video cut, then came back, this time inside the crawl space. A man sat there in the dark, humming, singing. My stomach clenched. The next video played. I heard my own voice. The camera was facing the ceiling, the wooden beams of my floor visible. Footsteps, my footsteps, moved above. Then the voice came, soft and mocking. "Oh, he's about to take a shower." I felt bow rise in my throat. Another video. A different night. I saw myself through my own bedroom window, completely unaware. Then came the voice again. "Hope to hear him fuck." I shut the laptop. My hands were shaking. My vision blurred with panic and rage. I grabbed the camera and smashed it against the floor. Again and again until the plastic cracked, until the lens shattered. I deleted the files. I ripped the memory card apart. Then I went outside and bolted the crawlspace door shut. That night, I heard the singing again. I barely had time to react before my dog started barking, louder and angrier than ever. I grabbed my gun and ran to the window. There he was, a figure crouched by the crawlspace door, yanking at the lock. I flipped on the porch light. The man flinched, his face snapping toward me. I couldn't see his features clearly, just the wild, desperate look in his movements. My dog was losing her mind, barking and snarling. The man let out a furious, frustrated noise, then ran. I burst out onto the porch, gun raised, heart pounding, but he was already disappearing into the woods. The trees swallowed him whole, his dark shape vanishing into the night. I never saw him again, but I never forgot. I grew up in a small, rural house on a quiet road. We had neighbors, but they weren't close, and at night, our property felt isolated. My bedroom was on the side of the house, next to a small shed attached to the building. The only thing separating my room from that shed was a set of glass doors. My parents mostly used the shed for storage, tools, old furniture, and random things that had no place in the house. For most of my childhood, I never thought much about it. The shed was just there, a part of the house I never really went into. But when I was around 12 or 13, something changed. I started hearing noises at night. At first, it was just soft sounds, what I assumed were animals moving around outside. That wasn't unusual. We lived in the country, so I was used to the sounds of raccoons, possums, or the occasional stray dog rustling through the grass at night. But this was different. It wasn't the random scratching or scurrying of small animals. These were footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving outside my room. Then I started seeing him. It wasn't every night, but often enough that I began dreading sunset. A dark figure would move past the glass doors, barely more than a shadow in the dim moonlight. Sometimes he would just stand there. I could see the faint outline of a person, unmoving, watching. Other times, he tried the handle of the glass door, testing it. When it didn't open, he would disappear into the dark. The first time it happened, I was frozen in fear, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the sounds of the night. I turned on my bedside lamp, and the second the light flickered on, the figure moved, quickly, disappearing from sight. I ran to my parents' room, breathless and shaking, trying to explain what I had seen. My dad groggily got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and walked outside to check. He found nothing. "It was probably just a shadow," he muttered, annoyed at being woken up. But it wasn't just a shadow. It happened again and again, almost every week, sometimes multiple nights in a row. I would wake up to the sound of movement outside the glass doors, and every time I turned on my light, the figure would vanish. But no matter how many times I told my parents, they didn't believe me. I don't blame them, looking back. There was never any proof. Nothing was ever missing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside the shed. To them, I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But I knew what I was seeing. I knew what I was hearing. One night, after weeks of this, I woke up to something different. The handle of the door was shaking. Not a quick test like before. This time, it was a steady, forceful rattling. Someone was really trying to open it. I bolted upright in bed, my stomach twisting into knots. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the glass, waiting, dreading what I might see. But the second I turned on my lamp, the sound stopped. And like always, when my dad checked outside, there was nothing. That was the night he lost patience with me. He was angry, tired of being woken up for what he thought was nothing. He told me to stop being dramatic. He slapped me across the face, not hard, but enough to make his frustration clear. I stopped waking them up after that, but I didn't stop hearing the footsteps. I became obsessed with the shed. During the day, when the sun was out and everything felt normal, I would go inside and inspect every inch of it, looking for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. I checked the door handle, the windows, the walls. Everything was intact. There was no sign that anyone had ever been in there at night. I started keeping track of the nights I heard the noises, writing them down in a little notebook. Patterns emerged. It was never random. It always happened on specific nights, always around the same time. The worst part was the feeling that I was losing my mind. Without proof, without anyone else witnessing it, I started doubting myself. Was it real? Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? But no matter how much I questioned it, I couldn't shake the fear. I moved my bed in front of the glass doors. It wasn't much, but it made me feel safer. I found a piece of scrap rebar in the yard and kept it next to my bed. If he ever got in, I would be ready. Then one afternoon, months after it all started, my dad picked me up early from school. The second I saw him standing outside my classroom, my stomach dropped. I thought I was in trouble. Maybe for waking him up so many times, for making things up, for being a burden. My brain wasn't working right. I was barely sleeping at this point, constantly on edge. I couldn't think straight. We drove home in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, there were police cars outside. I panicked. My mom met us at the door, her face pale, eyes red. She pulled me inside, sat me down, and explained everything. That morning, my dad had gone into the shed to grab some tools and realized a bunch of them were missing. Chainsaws, drills, things that would be hard to misplace. At first, he assumed someone had broken in during the night, but when he mentioned it to a neighbor, the truth came out. The neighbor's son, a guy in his late teens, had been stealing. Not just stealing. The police searched his room and found all the missing tools, along with something else. Photographs. Of me. Pictures of me outside. Pictures of me at school. Pictures of me in my bedroom, taken through the glass doors. It had been him. He had been coming to the shed for months, watching me, trying to get inside. The tools weren't even the main reason he was there. He only started stealing after the fact, after he had already been sneaking into the shed for God knows how long. I felt sick. The police asked me questions. I answered them the best I could. I told them everything, the footsteps, the figure outside my door, the shaking handle. They recorded everything I said, but I never had to go to court. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him. I never wanted to know. After everything, my parents felt awful. They apologized over and over, but there was nothing to be done about it now. I was just relieved it was over. For the first time in months, I slept without waking up in terror. I still thought about it, though. I still thought about what might have happened if I had been a heavy sleeper, if I hadn't woken up when he tried the door, if the lock had been weak, if he had ever actually gotten inside. But I tried not to dwell on it. Instead, I focused on the one good thing that came out of it. After months of begging, my parents finally let me get pet mice. I got a little brown one and named him Paprika, Pappy for short. He lived for 6 years, and I loved him more than anything. That whole experience shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until I was older. It made me more cautious, more aware. And it made me realize I wanted to work with animals. It was the only good thing to come out of those terrifying months. And even now, years later, I still can't look at glass doors at night without feeling watched. I've worked in mining for years, long enough to know that no matter how many safety measures you put in place, accidents still happen. People get comfortable, cut corners, or just get unlucky. There are 1,000 ways to get killed underground, and when it happens, it's rarely quick or clean. I work for a company that designs and installs conveyor systems, massive industrial belts that carry coal out of the mines. These belts run for kilometers, cutting through the dark, deep tunnels, moving at a steady 3 to 10 meters per second. Most places install emergency stop systems, like man-on-belt switches, but not all of them. In the past, miners used to ride the belts in and out of the mine, sitting on them like it was nothing. Those days are gone. Now the machinery is guarded and controlled, but it's still just as dangerous. I never met the guy, but I heard about him. His name isn't important because, to be honest, I doubt there was much of him left when it was all over. It was an old-timer who told me about it, casually mentioning it while we were installing a new drive system on a belt. He described it like it was just another story, something that happened, something that could happen again. The guy had been doing maintenance on the conveyor, standing on the belt while it was stopped. It's common practice. Sometimes you need to inspect a section, replace a roller, or clean out buildup. He was probably alone. Most of the time, guys worked in pairs, but when deadlines were tight, or someone was on a break, you did what needed to be done. He didn't see it coming. The ceiling in the mine was lined with wire mesh, a safeguard against falling debris. Without it, rocks could come loose and drop on workers at any time. It was a good idea in theory, but in his case, it was a death trap. Something above him shifted. A section of the roof gave way. The weight of the rocks, held together by the mesh, came down on top of him. Maybe it was gradual, a few stones falling first, giving him a split second to realize what was about to happen. Or maybe it all came at once, the whole section of mesh giving way, crushing him to the belt. The mesh pinned him down, twisted and tangled around him. If it hadn't been there, he might have been able to claw his way free, push the rocks off, drag himself to the side. But the metal wires held him tight. He was trapped, completely immobilized. And then he waited. Underground, it's never truly quiet. There's always something. The distant whir of machines, the occasional creak of the tunnels settling. But when you're trapped, unable to move, the sounds around you change. They become sharper, more distinct. He must have known what was coming. The siren went off. Standard procedure. Before a conveyor starts, a loud alarm sounds, warning everyone to get clear. It gives workers time to step away, make sure nothing is in the way. It echoed through the mine, a sharp, mechanical wail bouncing off the rock walls. And he was still there. He would have felt it before he saw it. The first slow jerk of the belt as it came to life, the vibration through his body as it shuddered and began to move. He was going toward the crusher. If you've never seen a coal crusher, you don't really understand. It's not like those office paper shredders where you can fish something out at the last second. A crusher is a massive machine made up of two enormous cylinders lined with thick, curved metal spikes. These spikes hook into the coal, drag it down between the cylinders, and grind it into smaller pieces before sending it further down the line. The process is relentless. Anything that goes in doesn't come out in one piece. He would have known. He had worked around these machines for years, probably seen them in action 100 times. Maybe he tried to scream, but underground, with the sound of the belt and the machinery, no one would have heard him. Maybe he tried to fight, but the mesh held him tight. The belt wasn't fast. At 3 to 10 meters per second, it gave him time to think, time to anticipate. He was alive for all of it. There was nothing he could do but wait. Somewhere along the way, he managed to pull off his wedding ring. Maybe he had to work at it, twisting it around his finger, knowing he only had moments left. Maybe it slipped off easily, the sweat and cold dust making his fingers slick. He threw it to the side, off the belt. That's how they knew, because there was nothing else left. By the time someone realized what had happened, it was too late. The coal kept moving. The crusher did what it was designed to do. The only thing they ever found was the ring, lying off to the side of the belt, like a final message. The coal kept coming. The thing about mining is that once the process starts, it doesn't stop. The coal is scooped up, loaded onto rail cars, and transported. It's washed, processed, burned in power stations. By the time anyone figured it out, he was long gone. No body, no remains, just coal. They never stopped the operation to look. There was nothing to look for. Maybe deep down they knew. But in the end, it didn't matter. The work continued. The mine kept running. Every once in a while, someone tells the story. They talk about the guy who got caught, the guy who disappeared. Some of the older workers don't like to discuss it. Others just shrug, another mining accident, one of many. But sometimes, when I stand by the belts, watching the coal move steadily along, I think about him. About how he was just another part of the system, another piece of material carried away, lost forever in the endless flow. And I wonder how many other stories like his are buried in the dark. It started as just another school lunch. A line of students shuffled forward, trays in hand, stopping at each station where lunch staff heaped servings of food onto the beige plastic trays. The cafeteria smelled like warm bread, mashed potatoes, and something vaguely fishy. It was always like that on Fridays, fish day. I stood there in line, staring at the metal tub of tuna mayo in the buffet section. The thick, pale mixture sat in a deep stainless steel container, lumpy and uneven, the color somewhere between dull gray and a sickly off-white. Bits of shredded fish stuck together in moist clumps, streaked with what looked like tiny red veins. It had been weeks since the first news broke. A human ear in a can of tuna. Not here, not at school, but somewhere else, somewhere close enough that people were talking about it. The whole thing had sounded like a messed-up urban legend at first, one of those gross-out stories kids passed around to freak each other out. But it wasn't a rumor. It had actually happened. Someone had cracked open a can of tuna, dumped it into a bowl, and found a severed human ear sitting right there among the shredded fish. The news had exploded after that. Everyone had questions. Whose ear was it? How did it get in there? Then, just a couple of weeks later, another report came out. A human finger. That's when the whole thing turned from disturbing to something far worse. Because it wasn't the same person. I remember reading about it, how the investigators said the ear and the finger belonged to different people, and how that led to a much darker realization. Nobody had been reported missing. Nobody had stepped forward to say, "Hey, I lost an ear," or "That's my finger," which meant whoever they belonged to was gone, and nobody was looking for them. At first, people thought it had to be some horrific accident at a fish factory. Maybe someone got their hand caught in a machine, and somehow, pieces of them ended up in the tuna before the mistake was noticed. But there was no recall, no warning, no announcement telling people to avoid certain brands. Just these scattered news reports and rumors. And now, here I was staring down at this tub of tuna in the lunch line, feeling my stomach twist. It was the same brand the school always used. Nobody had confirmed if the human tuna came from this specific supplier, but it was close enough to make me sick just thinking about it. My brain wouldn't stop picturing it, some unlucky worker in a fish factory, getting pulled into some kind of grinding machine, their body reduced to scraps and mixed into the fish meat, packed into metal cans, and shipped off to grocery stores and schools just like this one. I felt my appetite disappear completely. I watched the lunch lady scoop a huge spoonful of the tuna mixture and slap it onto the tray of the kid in front of me. It made a wet, slopping sound as it hit the surface. The smell, strong, fishy, slightly metallic, filled my nose. I swallowed hard. There were so many little bits in it. Some darker, some stringy. If someone had already found an ear and a finger, what else had been mixed in? What if there were more parts? What if nobody ever found them? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They hadn't found most of the two missing people. If two men had died in some accident at the plant, why had only tiny pieces of them been discovered? Where was the rest of them? The only explanation was the worst possible one. Some of them had been eaten. People had eaten human flesh without even knowing it. The thought made my legs feel weak. I took a small step back, my hands gripping the tray tightly. The kid in front of me had already moved on, and now it was my turn. I hesitated. The lunch lady stared at me. She looked tired, impatient. She'd probably been serving food all day without a second thought. To her, it was just tuna mayo. But to me, it was something else entirely. I thought about turning away, just skipping lunch altogether. But my stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I didn't want the tuna, but I needed something. I shifted to the side, grabbing a bread roll and some mashed potatoes instead. When I finally sat down at my usual table, I could still smell it. The other kids were eating, laughing, talking about normal things. But my mind was stuck on that awful thought. How many people had already eaten it? The truth didn't come out all at once. It took weeks before investigators traced the problem back to its source. The supplier was massive. They sold bulk-cooked tuna to dozens of factories and processing plants. That was the problem. So many different places handled the fish before it reached stores and schools. The pieces of human meat could have come from anywhere. Eventually, the news broke. It was a fish processing plant, a rundown, dangerous place that had been secretly hiring illegal Chinese migrants to work under horrifying conditions. These weren't normal workers. They had no papers, no records, no rights. They were trapped, forced to work in horrible conditions, using dangerous, outdated machinery that should have been scrapped years ago. I had never been the kind of person who got scared easily. Horror movies were fun, sure, but they didn't really stick with me. I wasn't one of those people who left the theater still on edge, checking the back seat of their car or peering around corners in their own house like a serial killer might be crouching there, waiting for them. No, horror was just entertainment, a bunch of flickering images on a screen. At least, that's what I told myself. We had watched Ringu the night before, *the Ringu, the Japanese original that inspired The Ring. I had never seen it before, but I knew the premise. Cursed videotape, eerie long-haired girl, people dying when she crawled out of their TV sets. A classic ghost story, but something about it was different from other horror movies. It wasn't loud or over the top like American horror flicks. It was slow, creeping, and unnerving. There was no big orchestral soundtrack that told you when to be scared. Instead, the horror seeped in slowly, like cold air through a cracked window. By the time the credits rolled, the room had gone quiet. No one spoke for a moment, and when someone finally did, it was just nervous laughter. Ha, yeah, that was creepy star. But the thing is, we all felt it. That lingering unease. Like something had stuck to us. The kind of feeling that made you hesitate before turning off the lights at night. Still, I hadn't thought much about it after leaving my friend's place. It was a movie. That's all. The next morning was completely normal. I slept in a little later than usual, woke up groggy, and spent way too long scrolling through my phone in bed before finally dragging myself to the bathroom for a shower. I liked my showers hot enough to turn the small bathroom into a sauna. By the time I stepped out, steam was clinging to the mirror, water droplets beating and running down the glass like sweat. The air was thick with leftover heat. I grabbed my towel and ran it over my arms, my face, my chest, stepping carefully onto the bath mat so I wouldn't slip. The quiet hum of the fan was the only sound as I dried off. Everything felt normal. Just another lazy morning. I wrapped the towel around my waist and padded into the living room, still rubbing my hair with the smaller towel. The couch looked inviting, so I sank into it with a satisfied sigh, stretching my legs out. The towel was still damp against my skin, and the cool air from the ceiling fan gave me a small shiver. Then, the TV turned on. The screen flared to life with a sudden blue glow, the sound of static filling the room. My body locked up, muscles tensing on pure instinct. My heart jolted. For a split second, my brain refused to make sense of it. I just sat there frozen, staring at the TV like it had personally insulted me. Then, before I could even react, the shower turned back on. A loud burst of water splattered against the tile, echoing from the bathroom down the hall. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my body tip backward, almost falling off the couch as I scrambled to my feet. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I was panicking, fully panicking, and my mind was throwing out every horrible explanation it could come up with. I had just watched Ringu. The ghost girl came out of the TV. Water dripped everywhere when she did. I knew it was just a movie. I knew. But in that moment, none of that logic mattered. Some deep, primal part of my brain was screaming, run, run, run. I whipped around, heart pounding so hard it made me lightheaded. My eyes darted between the TV and the bathroom door, still slightly ajar, steam curling out from the crack. The shower was still running. And then, I saw it. The remote. Lying right there. Under me. I had sat on it. Realization hit me like a slap to the face. I slowly reached down, picked up the remote, and turned off the TV. The static blinked out. Then, still standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard, I turned toward the bathroom. My pulse was still racing, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from embarrassment. I walked back down the hall, stepping over the bath mat, and reached into the shower. The water was still running, but as soon as I turned the knob, it stopped with a sharp click. Leftover pressure in the pipes. That was all it was. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the drain, listening to the last few droplets splatter against the tile. Then I let out a long, shaky breath and laughed. Not a normal laugh, one of those weird, breathy, I can't believe it just freaked out kind of laughs. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of secondhand embarrassment from myself. No one had even seen me freak out, but that didn't stop me from replaying the whole thing in my head over and over. The worst part, that wasn't the only weird connection I had to the movie. Later that night, after I had mostly gotten over my dumb little scare, I was scrolling through my phone when I remembered something. My ex-girlfriend's mom used to teach piano. One of her students, the actress who played the ghost girl in Ringu, her own family refused to watch the movie. I wondered if they had ever sat on a remote at the wrong time. I never liked night shifts at camp. During the day, the place felt alive, kids running around, counselors leading activities, the lake full of splashing and laughter. But at night, when the lanterns and campfires were out, the entire place felt different. The cabins, scattered across the property, seemed isolated. The forest pressed in on all sides, just a dark wall of trees beyond the floodlights near the dining hall. And out past the gravel road, beyond the main entrance, was nothing. No houses, no streetlights, just miles and miles of Vermont wilderness. I never thought about how remote we were during the day. But during the night shift, when it was just me, Gabe, and a few other counselors spread out across the camp to make sure the kids didn't sneak out, the isolation settled in. There was no cell service unless you hiked up to the ridge, and even then, it was spotty. We had no real security. No gates. Just a wooden sign near the entrance with the camp's name, and a dirt parking lot big enough for the camp vans and a few staff cars. If someone really wanted to walk in from the road, there was nothing stopping them. That night, Gabe and I were assigned to watch the girls' cabins. Usually, it was an easy shift, just walking around, listening for noises, checking to make sure none of the older kids were sneaking out to meet up. We weren't expecting anything weird, but around 1:30 a.m., we saw someone walking toward the cabins. At first, we thought it was just one of the older guys from the boys' side, maybe waking up a girl's cabin to sneak out. We'd caught kids trying before, dumb teenage stuff, sneaking out to the lake or the woods to try and scare each other. But as we got closer, I realized something was off. The figure was tall, wearing all black. Not a camp hoodie, not pajama pants, just black from head to toe. The way he moved was slow, deliberate. He wasn't running or sneaking, just walking in a straight line toward the cabins like he belonged there. Gabe must have noticed it too, because he whispered, "That's not a camper." We picked up the pace, jogging over, our flashlights bobbing in the dark. "Hey," Gabe called. The figure stopped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to let us know he'd heard. But instead of answering, he bolted. And I mean bolted. 1 second he was standing there, the next he was sprinting toward the parking lot, moving faster than I thought possible. Gabe reacted immediately, taking off after him. I hesitated, my heart hammering, my brain trying to process what was happening. Then I followed, but Gabe was already yards ahead of me. The guy had a head start, but Gabe was fast. He caught up to him just as he reached the edge of the lot and tackled him to the ground. By the time I got there, Gabe had the guy pinned. The dude was struggling, twisting, trying to break free. His hood had slipped halfway off, but I still couldn't see his face. I was trying to pull my phone out, fumbling to get service so I could call someone, anyone, and then the guy punched Gabe in the face. It wasn't a wild, panic swing. It was controlled, precise. He knew how to fight. Gabe grunted and let go for a second, just enough for the guy to scramble to his feet. Before either of us could react, he sprinted toward his car, a dark-colored sedan at the far end of the lot. He knew exactly where it was. He had parked far from the other vehicles, as if he'd planned an escape route. I was still trying to get a signal as he yanked the door open, threw himself inside, and peeled out of the lot, gravel kicking up behind him. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there, breathing hard, the cold air stinging my lungs. Gabe was holding his face, swearing under his breath. My hands were shaking. I still couldn't get a signal. We had no license plate, no name, nothing. Just a man in black who had been walking toward the girls' cabins in the middle of nowhere at 1:30 a.m. We had no idea what to do. The camp director's cabin was on the other side of the property. Waking him up would mean running through the woods, and neither of us wanted to go anywhere alone after what just happened. The only thing we could think to do was head to the food hall, which was well lit and had a landline phone. We sat there for the rest of our shift, the camp silent around us. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's shadowy figure walking toward the cabins. I thought about how confidently he had moved. He hadn't been confused. He hadn't been wandering. He had known exactly where he was going. And that's what scared me the most. By morning, we told the camp director everything. He was shaken but tried to downplay it, saying it was probably some lost hiker or a hunter who got turned around. But that guy wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going, and we never saw him again.